Today, it is the most powerful court in the land. But it didn't start out that way.
It had so little prestige as an institution that it was really an afterthought.
The United States Supreme Court is a human institution, shaped and forged by the justices themselves.
John Marshall really changed the way judges do business.
He thought that a unanimous court spoke with a stronger voice.
This is the story of one nation under law, the Supreme Court.
The issues change. Before the Civil War, the issues were slavery or state sovereignty, federalism. In the last part of the 20th century, the issues are culture war issues. But again, you have this Constitution that doesn't yield real clear answers.
Justices are trying to apply the Constitution in light of all of American history and in light of the peculiar circumstances that we as a nation find ourselves in today. And it's hardly surprising that under all these circumstances, different people will have different views on what the Constitution means. It would be an incredibly weird country if everyone agreed on everything.
The court will never be that far out of tune with the prevailing attitudes and prejudices of its time. Nevertheless, when the court speaks, it's supposed to speak for what the country stands for, our basic values, our highest aspirations. And so we put a lot of faith in the court, and a lot of us want the court not to let us down.
The Supreme Court did not always hold such sway in the life of the nation. In the early years of the Republic, justices were unsure how far their power extended and shy to exert it. One man changed all that.
I think nobody, until Marshall comes along, I think that anybody really have a coherent vision of how powerful this institution could become.
The base that Marshall built in law and in tradition transcends his life and animates the rest of American history. Part of the genius of John Marshall is that in a very real sense, he invented the Supreme Court.
The United States Supreme Court was written into being at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The framers knew they wanted an independent judiciary, free from the pressures of politics, but little else was determined. The Supreme Court's inaugural session did not portend a powerful future.
For the first year, nothing comes to the court. They have a 2-hour session in 1790. They have no cases, and they all go home. They're given a second floor room in some building in New York. I mean, nobody sees this as having the majesty of the executive branch or the legislative branch.
The Supreme Court was a court of law, but it wasn't established as a constitutional court. So its early decisions tended to be just everyday, run-of-the-mill legal disputes, not great constitutional questions.
Congress originally set the number of seats on the court at 6, lifetime appointments all. But it was no mean task keeping the bench filled.
Membership on the Supreme Court was in a great deal of flux. People didn't stay on the court very long. The first Chief Justice, John Jay, left to be governor of New York.
The president wanted to appoint John Jay to the court again, and he refused. He declined. He said, the Supreme Court is not an institution with a lot of energy. It's just not a great job. I'm going to take a pass on that.
It had so little prestige as an institution at that point that it was really an afterthought. The court was off on the sideline and played almost no role.
It was the tumble of partisan politics, not the imperatives of the Constitution, not the majesty of the law, that drew the Supreme Court into the momentous battles of the early Republic, that vaulted a 45-year-old Virginia politician named John Marshall to the bench, and that started the court toward its destiny as a dynamic and co-equal branch of the federal government. By the time George Washington retired from the presidency in 1797, the country had split into factions, the first political parties. New President John Adams and Federalists such as Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall on one side, Vice President Thomas Jefferson and his new party on the other. Their differences seemed fundamental and had widened as each side watched the democratically fueled French Revolution devolve into mass murder of the aristocracy.
For Marshall, the French Revolution was anarchy, attacking order, attacking property. Jefferson's response was, it's a good thing to spill a little blood every once in a while. You need to do that. A little revolution is a good thing. It shakes people up.
Federalists didn't intend to let unchecked democracy, the mad passions of the people, threaten their fragile new republic. To hold the mob in check, they championed a stout national government, led by the educated and landed elite.
Jefferson believed that the Federalists represented a new monarchy, not much different from that which we declared our independence from in Great Britain.
When Hamilton said, I think we need a standing army, the Jeffersonians immediately assumed the worst. What are you going to use this army for? To oppress us, to draw all power to yourself.
The Federalists had, in fact, consolidated their power in government. They controlled the executive branch and the Congress, and had appointed each and every federal judge. From his Virginia plantation, Vice President Jefferson began running an all-out insurgency against the ruling party. A second revolution, he called it. He meant to ride people power to the presidency. As Jefferson stirred dissent, visions of the French Revolution danced in Federalist heads.
Jefferson was known for his Francophile leanings, and there was real concern that there would be bloodshed in Washington if Jefferson came in, and heads would roll, almost literally.
You could look back at that and say it was ridiculous to think that Jefferson was going to lead a revolution that led to bloodshed, but at the moment things were pretty much up for grabs.
The politics of the day were partisan and ugly, and there was no precedent or tradition that demanded the judicial branch steer clear. Federalist-appointed lower court judges enforced the plainly unconstitutional Sedition Act, tossing Jeffersonian pamphleteers and politicians in jail for merely criticizing President Adams. And as the election of 1800 neared, many of those judges campaigned openly against Thomas Jefferson. Then the Jeffersonians won, big. Jefferson took the White House from Adams, and his party men swept into majorities in the House and the Senate. But there was no way to sweep the nation's courts of Federalist partisans Jefferson despised. Judges were appointed for life. The Federalists, wrote Jefferson, have retired into the judiciary as a stronghold. And John Adams meant to shore up the Federalist breastworks. In the aftermath of the election, the angry lame duck president installed his close friend and then Secretary of State, John Marshall, as the new Chief Justice of the United States. Marshall's appointment blocked Jefferson from naming his own chief, and it sent a clear signal to the incoming president. John Marshall would be watching him. When Thomas Jefferson arrived at the executive offices, 17 commissions sat signed, sealed, and undelivered. He directed his new Secretary of State, James Madison, to leave them lay. 10 months later, a would-be Justice of the Peace named William Marbury showed up at the Supreme Court, asking Marshall and his brethren to compel Madison to deliver his commission. John Marshall ordered Madison to show just cause for withholding Marbury's commission, Madison didn't feel obliged to bow to the court. He simply didn't answer. But when word of Marshall's demand spread through the Capitol, the Jeffersonians in Congress were not so passive.
Congress passes a law that basically closes down the Supreme Court for a full term. They just cancel the term by statute. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says they can't do that specifically. On the other hand, it's a pretty aggressive attack on the court.
There was the real feeling on the part of the justices that their days were numbered. And Marshall himself, I think, felt under considerable threat of impeachment.
The court was in its congressionally enforced recess for 14 months, while the Jeffersonians threatened to dismantle the entire Adams-built judiciary. Marshall stayed home in Richmond, Virginia, with his wife Polly and their 6 children, puzzling out his next move in Marbury versus Madison. He didn't have a lot of good options.
If he backed down, if he was seen to back down, the court would lose all prestige. It would take generations for the court to recover from that act of cowardice. If, on the other hand, Marshall bravely gave an order to President Jefferson, command the Secretary of State to convey the commission, the administration would disobey, they'd pay no attention to the court order. And in that case, the Supreme Court of the United States would be a laughingstock.
Marshall doesn't want to have that situation because then the court looks powerless, and it sets a precedent that the court doesn't have to be obeyed. Everything people do in this time is setting a precedent. They're very aware that it's the first time for everything.
When Congress permitted the Supreme Court to reconvene in February of 1803, the first case on the docket was Marbury versus Madison. The court was meeting in the lobby of a Washington hotel, and partisans on both sides milled the halls, anxiously awaiting the court's judgment. When Marshall announced the decision, it confounded almost everyone.
He says, well, Mr. Marbury, you have been wronged. The Jefferson administration has completely illegally withheld your commission, and that's a horrible, terrible thing, and we deeply feel your pain. However, just when Marbury thought he had won, see, you're in the wrong place to get any help, and this is not the proper tribunal for us to help you, so good luck with that. Bye.
Most Jeffersonians thought of it as a victory for the Jeffersonian administration because, in fact, they had won. This guy wanted to have a court order Madison to do something, and Marshall said no.
It was trumpeted as something of a victory for Jefferson. It made it hard for Jefferson, who I think realized very quickly that it wasn't such a big victory.
It took some doing to untangle Marshall's opinion. The Chief Justice had taken Jefferson to task for trampling Marbury's rights. He'd also asserted the power to force the president to comply with the court order. But he'd run away from the real fight, explaining that he was powerless to issue such an order in Marbury, because in this particular case, the Supreme Court did not have jurisdiction.
In order to hold that there's no jurisdiction, he has to strike down an act of Congress. And so, as part of his holding that there is no jurisdiction, his way of backing out and takes the power of judicial review to boot.
The court's power of judicial review, the ability to strike down any law repugnant to the Constitution, was not written into the Constitution itself. Jefferson believed the court had little standing to be the final word on the constitutionality of laws. In fact, he thought it dangerous to give so much power to men who were appointed for life and did not answer to voters. But in his Marbury opinion, in his own hand, John Marshall scrawled into the record the court's central power.
Judicial review is the capacity to say this law does not comport with the Constitution. It's not really law. It's void. The trick is that nothing in the Constitution says that the Supreme Court has this power. No language in Article 3, which creates the courts, No language in any part of the Constitution says the court has the power to strike legislation. We know the president can veto legislation because Article 1, Section 7 says he can. We know the Supreme Court can strike down legislation as unconstitutional because John Marshall said it could.
It was emphatically, as he said in Marbury versus Madison, emphatically the province and duty of the courts to say what the law is, and the Constitution is law. In most governments, if not all at that time, a Constitution was regarded as a political document. Marshall's real significant and unique contribution was to view the Constitution as law. And once you accept that the Constitution is law, then the courts have a significant role because courts tell you what the law means.
He's asserting the constitutional equality of the court in the constitutional scheme, that they were going to push back, that they had a role to play, a major role to play, the major role to play perhaps, in interpreting the meaning of the constitutional text.
Marshall holds down a decision that Jefferson despises. The court has the power of judicial review, but does so in a way that Jefferson can't evade it. I mean, the only way Jefferson can get around the decision in Marbury v. Madison is to give Marbury his commission. I don't care what Marshall says. Here is your commission. Well, Jefferson's not going to do that. That is classic Marshall.
So a pretty good day for John Marshall, right? He's avoided a political crisis, he's publicly scolded the president for behaving badly, and he's established the most important power that the court owns. There is no Brown versus Board of Education, there is no Roe versus Wade, there is no Bush v. Gore without a power of judicial review.
In 1803, the notion of the Supreme Court having the stature to decide a presidential election was laughable. John Marshall had barely extricated the court from the political noose in Marbury, and its future hardly appeared secure. Court sessions took place in a cramped, meanly furnished Senate committee room, an old potato hole of a place, one writer called it. Justices had no private chambers, no conference room, no library, nothing to suggest permanence. Marshall was careful not to further antagonize the president. The Chief Justice shed the scarlet and ermine robe reminiscent of the British judges Jefferson despised, choosing to wear a plain black robe. The other justices followed his lead. More important, Marshall was careful not to challenge the elected branches of the federal government.
Marshall never again uses the power of judicial review against the national government. In effect, what you had was a negotiated settlement between Marshall and the Jeffersonians. The Jeffersonians were willing to agree to the idea of judicial review as long as they knew that federal judges could be trusted with the power. Marshall made the exercise of judicial power appear safe.
Marshall established a much lower tone. He was very sensitive to the vulnerability of the court and was quite anxious to establish it as a nonpartisan, non-political branch of government.
His fellow justices quickly came to appreciate their chief's ability to steer the court through the roughest of political storms. They also came to appreciate his ability to add flair to their otherwise dull days and nights. No justice was willing to subject his family to the swampy, mosquito-infested, and primitive capital under construction, Washington City. So, for the 6 to 8 weeks the court was in session each year, the justices lived as bachelors.
John Marshall convinced the early justices that they ought to board together in the same boarding house so they could take their meals together, and he made sure they had plenty of Madeira to have at those meals. He was a very sociable, convivial host.
Part of the atmosphere of being on the court was you were all in it together, in this almost a martial way, I guess. This is like their barracks, and you live together, and then you think of yourselves as the band of brothers.
Marshall just loved the give and take of this company, the congeniality. He liked to have a drink now and then, which helped to get over the difficult points, I imagine, in mooting cases. He did buy wine by the pipe, which is, if I'm not mistaken, 126 gallons. Certainly it must have eased discussions occasionally.
Through a combination of charm and sort of institutional authority, Marshall put his stamp on the way the justices acted as a collective?
Marshall really changed the way judges do business. Prior to that time, the model that had prevailed in the United States was the British model, where however many judges you have on a particular bench, they would each give you their views at the end of the case. They would tell you what they think. And if you had 7 justices sitting, then you'd get 7 different opinions, and you'd try to figure out what they mean.
There was no court. There were a bunch of different justices, each of them opining on any issue that came before them. Marshall starts his practice of having an opinion for the court.
He felt that very strongly in those early days of the court. He thought that a unanimous court spoke with a stronger voice and could thereby earn the respect of the American people.
He was convivial, he liked the Madeira, but he was perfectly capable to issue gentle threats to get his way. Justice William Johnson made clear that when Johnson wanted to dissent, Marshall made it clear to him that there would be consequences to this.
The beauty of the unanimous opinion of the court was that it suggested certainty, even infallibility. A Supreme Court decision was beyond argument because the justices had found truth in the text. Political considerations were beside the point. And once John Marshall had solidified the authority of the court and scrubbed it of the taint of politics, he began to use it to advance a remarkably sweeping political agenda, to weigh in on the great argument that had bedeviled the young republic since its founding.
America's founders were children of the Enlightenment. They are living in an age of reason. They are seeing remarkable discoveries in the natural sciences. And the framers of the Constitution believe that they can discover enduring principles of political science that are every bit as important and powerful as laws of the natural sciences.
It's a man-made reflection in a sense of the universe, of how they thought the universe was working. It was how they were thinking about the natural world in this sort of balanced and opposing forces. And I think it was very natural for them to think about the social world in the same way.
It was a singular experiment, assigning distinct but overlapping powers to 2 separate sovereignties, the federal government and the individual states. In the 20 years since that uncertain balance had been negotiated at the Constitutional Convention, Americans had discovered only one thing for sure. Nature might be governed by hard, fast, and immutable laws. Government is not. A deep divide still separated the champions of a strong central government from those who cherished state sovereignty.
You really had 2 major views about what the Constitution really stood for that are really well embodied in Jefferson and in John Marshall. From Jefferson's point of view, the Constitution creates a relatively small national government. Marshall, on the other hand, thought that the Constitution had created a great American republic, that its greatness was in its unity and in the power of its national government.
Marshall's belief in a strong union wasn't some glorious abstraction. It came straight from his life, most especially from his service as a young infantry officer in the Revolutionary War. For Marshall, the unforgettable lesson of that war began in the days before Christmas 1777, when General George Washington's army retreated into the frozen hills of eastern Pennsylvania. At Valley Forge, 22-year-old Lieutenant John Marshall counted nearly 4,000 men unfit for duty for want of clothes. Scarcely one man of these, he later wrote, had a pair of shoes. George Washington begged the states for provisions to no avail. The Continental Army was nearly destroyed by the indifference of the states. The Continental Congress was powerless to help.
The powers of Congress were essentially limited by the fact that the states were sovereign. So they could request that the states supply troops and supplies, but they had no way of enforcing it. It was pretty much impossible to conduct a war you know, if you have 13 states doing what they think is in their best interest of the states. And this is the thing which Washington complained about, which Marshall undertook to remedy, I guess you might say, in his political career, and of course in his career as Chief Justice.
John Marshall kept the lessons of war close to heart. The greatest danger to a strong union, as he saw it, would always be the state legislatures, which were too likely to be swayed by the people's fleeting and irrational passions.
Marshall regarded his first government as Congress, not Virginia, and it's because he fought at peril of his life and bravely to establish that government at a time when I think most people would reflexively regard themselves as a citizen of Massachusetts, citizen of Pennsylvania, citizen of Virginia. He was first a citizen of the United States, and you see that reflected in the decisions of his court.
John Marshall inherits a constitution that doesn't have very many no state shall clauses, but the ones that it does have, he makes the most of. When individual states misbehave, John Marshall's court slaps them down.
Marshall's first great chance came just as Thomas Jefferson was leaving the presidency in 1809, in a case involving America's most valued commodity, land. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, the issues in Fletcher versus Peck had been bouncing around state and federal courts for almost 15 years. The story began back in the 1790s, when the state of Georgia was in desperate need of cash.
In 1795, the Georgia legislature sold 35 million acres for 1.5 cents an acre, which seems very low and may be explicable by the fact that every legislator voting for it had been bribed.
Land that is the equivalent of the states of Alabama and Mississippi. I mean, huge chunks of land. It goes to these 4 big landholders who then in turn sell this land at a big profit to lots of other people.
The election comes up, the voters find this out, they get very angry. Of course, they throw the bums out on their ears.
The Georgia voters in 1796 wanted to put in a legislature that would repeal the grant, and indeed they did.
But by the time the new legislature does this, the land is in the hand of second or third or fourth parties. So then the question becomes, can the legislature essentially take back property that it had sold to investors?
The voters in Georgia sure thought so. This land had been a public trust, and the first legislature had given it away. Few of the beneficiaries were fellow Georgians. Most were northern speculators, in it for the profits. But John Marshall had little sympathy for the brutish will of the majority. The Georgians had attacked 2 things the Chief Justice prized: order and private property. Marshall himself was an enthusiastic and unapologetic land speculator. For Marshall, the right to acquire and possess private property, free from irrational government intrusion, was a God-given right, at the heart of the revolution in which he'd fought. Marshall believed that if a state legislature could arbitrarily void private contracts, the whole structure of commerce would be undermined.
Marshall thought that what was great about the national government was its ability to promote a commercial republic. So for Marshall, in a case like Fletcher versus Peck, the important question from his point of view was really the protection of the kind of entrepreneurial spirit and the basic rights of property and contract that were really central to his vision of the Constitution.
It's a protection of private property. Private property is a theme that runs through American politics to this very day. This was about protecting individual rights. This was about protecting minorities from majorities.
In its Fletcher opinion in 1810, the court essayed a full-throated defense of private property rights, and Marshall himself stretched the issue into a constitutional one, applying the contract clause for the first time in the court's history. No state could retroactively invalidate a private contract. Georgia is a part of a large empire, She is a member of the American Union, Marshall wrote, and that union has a constitution which imposes limits to the legislatures of the several states. With Marshall in the lead, the Supreme Court, for the first time in its history, was rechanneling the rippling currents of the times. The Marshall Court extended contract clause protection to public as well as private contracts. It also invalidated New York State's grant of a steamboat monopoly, opening the nation's navigable waterways as great flowing arteries of traffic and trade. Marshall's crowning decision came in 1819 in a case involving the Second Bank of the United States. The bank had been chartered by Congress to work toward a more uniform system of currency and credit. Despite its name, the Bank of the United States was not a public entity, but a profitable monopoly controlled by private stockholders. It also competed with state and local banks. And in 1818, when the nation slid into economic depression, the Bank of the United States was the obvious scapegoat.
The economy is in turmoil. People are losing money. Land prices are falling. The prices of slaves are falling for people in the South. So it's a time of panic.
And in the areas that were hit hardest, the South and the West, the bank was just hated. And you had states like Maryland and then Ohio that did everything within their power to put the bank out of existence.
Maryland decided to fight back. So they passed a bill which taxed the Bank of the United States and its Baltimore headquarters. The cashier of the Baltimore branch, a man named James McCulloch, refused to pay the tax. And he said, we're an entity of the United States, you can't do that.
What was really at issue in McCulloch against Maryland is which government was going to be dominant, the governments of the states or the government of the United States.
The state of Maryland sued McCulloch in a Maryland court and won. McCulloch appealed to the United States Supreme Court. Marshall and his fellow brethren heard McCulloch's appeal in their dramatic and dearly refurbished new courtroom in the Capitol. Under the vaulted ceiling, among pillars modeled on the Temple of Poseidon, Marshall kicked Maryland in the teeth. The Chief Justice dismissed out of hand a state's right to tax any national entity. The power to tax, he said, is the power to destroy. And Marshall took on a larger question. Did Congress have the right to create a bank at all? The Constitution certainly didn't speak to the point. But Marshall did, finding implied powers in the constitutional phrase necessary and proper, ceding to Congress the authority to regulate and encourage interstate commerce. States would have to fall in line.
This was a new nation, and he was going to ensure that it had the authority that the founders intended it to have. You know, Lincoln's famous statement, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, is just a paraphrase of what he said in McCulloch against Maryland, that this national government was founded not by the states, but by the people, and for their benefit. People can debate whether Lincoln's expression is more eloquent than Marshall's, but it's the same sentiment and the same thought, and I think born in each case from the fact that they were fighting to preserve the Union.
A few weeks after he handed down the McCulloch decision, Marshall returned home to Richmond, where his fellow Virginians treated him as something of a traitor to his home state. The landed aristocracy was sure Marshall's McCulloch decision threatened its dear way of life, a way of life built largely on slave labor.
Virginians, by the 18-teens, 1820s, their economy is falling apart, their soil is exhausted, they're starting to export their slaves south. And they're worried about the future of slavery and what are they going to do with this huge population of African Americans if they're ever freed. So they're now more pessimistic, they're more defensive, and they see John Marshall celebrating the power of the national government at the very moment when the national government is perhaps starting to pose a threat to slavery.
If the powers of Congress were not simply specified and delimited, who is there to say that Congress could not abolish slavery and take your slaves from you?
Slavery had been a rare point of agreement between John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson. Both men had been uneasy slavers. They shared the public stance that blacks should be emancipated and then shipped out of the country. By 1820, the men had split on this issue too. Jefferson could not abide Northern politicians in Congress dictating the terms of ending slavery, and he could not abide that John Marshall's McCulloch decision had given them an opening to do just that. Long retired from the presidency, the sage of Monticello stirred.
Jefferson was furious about McCulloch versus Maryland. He saw this as an assault on his vision of state sovereignty, and he encouraged his acolytes to write pamphlets defending a vision of state sovereignty so radical that it eventually blossomed into the theory that would lead to the Civil War.
Marshall, and in the Supreme Court, he meant to protect both, so he was careful not to arouse the pro-slavery states' rights crowd. But the Chief Justice saw real trouble on the horizon, in the person of Andrew Jackson, who was swept into the presidency in 1828 by the rabble Marshall had always feared.
Andrew Jackson earned his reputation not as a gentleman philosopher writing declarations of independence and constitutions. Jackson earned his reputation on the battlefield as really a quite ruthless leader of men in battle. He's really the first public figure vying for national office that temperamentally was not a gentleman, but represented instead the lower classes.
Andrew Jackson was a man you crossed at your peril. He was an avid and accomplished duelist, having killed 3 men, and he had 1 ball of shot lodged in his chest and 1 in his shoulder, both from duels. Recurring infections required vigilance, making Jackson the only president to ever bleed himself in the White House. Unlike Jefferson, Andrew Jackson wasn't keen to diminish the court's power. He meant to own it. In 2 terms, Jackson would appoint 5 justices to the Supreme Court. 4 were solid states' writers and strong supporters of slavery. The new justices resisted the charming orbit of the chief, choosing to take their own separate Washington City lodgings. The convivial boarding house broke up. Dissents were more frequent. Marshall even found himself looking for room to compromise with the states' rights bloc. There was one notable exception. The Cherokee Indians had lived for nearly 40 years on land they held by treaty with the federal government. Unfortunately, it was in one of the most recalcitrant states in the country, Georgia. When gold was discovered on the Cherokee lands, the Georgia legislature grabbed for it, openly defying the federal treaty.
The state of Georgia is just trying to kick them out and send them to territory which was not their ancestral home, and basically saying, go out there and start over.
President Jackson, an old Indian fighter, was with Georgia. The president, like the U.S. Congress, plainly wanted the Cherokees removed to make way for the white man. And Marshall no longer appeared equal to Jackson's monumental will. As 2 separate Cherokee cases moved through the Supreme Court, woe seemed to pile on the head of the aging Chief Justice. In October of 1831, Marshall underwent bladder surgery without the aid of anesthesia. While he was convalescing at home in Richmond, his wife died. When Marshall returned to the business of the court, he was clearly diminished. A colleague went to Marshall's room one morning and found him weeping. A lawyer flinched when the Chief Justice arrived at the court unshaven, with egg on his face. But when the time came to issue a decision on the final Cherokee case, John Marshall refused to stand down. For the first time in his career, he took on the entire political system, President, Congress, and a state government. Georgia's seizure of Cherokee lands, Marshall found, was illegal.
This may be an apocryphal story, but Jackson said, well, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Knowing full well that Marshall and the Brethren aren't going to go out and stop the movement of Native Americans into the interior part of the country. What Jackson knew, and what Marshall knew as well, is that the reach of judicial power extends as far as the executive is willing to enforce it.
There are only a couple of examples in all of the history of our country where presidents did not enforce some relevant applicable decision of the Supreme Court. One was President Andrew Jackson, and the result was disaster for the Cherokee Indians.
Andrew Jackson negotiated action with the Cherokees to send them, in a sense, on this incredible trek west of the Mississippi River, in which thousands of them, men, women, and children, died on the way. And once they got there, of course, they had no land, as it turns out. It was one of the great tragedies, certainly, in American history.
The lingering lesson of the Cherokee cases is that the power of the court is merely the power to persuade. Unless the court's decisions are brought to life by the rest of the political system, they're just words.
Marshall was in failing health. The national political tide was turning against him. His wife had died. He transferred, to an extent, the pain and suffering that he felt personally to the experiment that he had been an intimate part of. He feared the worst. He feared that the nation, the centrifugal forces, would blow the nation apart, that the center wouldn't hold. This would work against everything he had worked for on the Supreme Court. It would undermine his understanding of the Constitution, and in so doing, culminate in the demise of the nation that he had served.
John Marshall died in July 1835. The Union he'd fought for held. Even Andrew Jackson had defended it against Southern secessionists. The Supreme Court enjoyed a place of pride and prestige among the nation's youthful institutions. But it would have come as no surprise to Marshall to learn that Andrew Jackson appointed as Chief Justice a states' writer named Roger Taney. At the end of his life, John Marshall knew the threats to the Supreme Court and to the Union outlived him. I yield to the conviction that our Constitution cannot last, Marshall had written shortly before his death. The Union has been prolonged thus far by miracles. They cannot continue. It is one of history's sad ironies that the Supreme Court became an animating force for John Marshall's dark prophecy of disunion. The issue of slavery, which Marshall had taken pains to avoid, was the undoing of the court and the Union both. For 30 years, back to the time of Marshall's McCulloch decision, the Union was largely held together by a bit of legislative baling wire called the Missouri Compromise. Territories below 3630 would enter the nation as slave states, territories above as free. It was federal law negotiated in the U.S. Congress. But in 1854, when it looked like the balance of power was shifting to free states, Southern legislators demanded a New Deal.
The country had come to the end of the line. It had tried so hard in so many ways to deal with the issue of slavery. And by the mid-1850s, desperate times had called for desperate measures. And there was no other institution that they could turn to try finally to resolve this issue than the court that Marshall helped create.
The politicians actually invite the court to get involved in this, to take this hot potato out of their laps.
Led by Marshall's successor, Roger Taney, a usually steady and moderating Chief Justice, the Supreme Court took on Dred Scott versus Sanford. The case was a plea for freedom by one man, but begged the questions of slavery, states' rights, and federal power. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave whose owner had taken him, his wife and 2 daughters, to live in the free state of Illinois, then the Free Territory of Wisconsin, before returning to Missouri. Scott and his attorneys argued that once he had lived on free soil, he was a free man. Congress, in the Missouri Compromise, had made it plain.
I think Justice Taney wanted to make a pronouncement, make it known what his thoughts were about where blacks belonged in American life. And in order to do that, he goes back to the very beginning and makes the argument that blacks were never intended to be a part of the American experiment, and he wanted to be on record with that.
The opinion in Dred Scott says the Congress of the United States has to enforce slavery. Slavery must exist in all federal territory. Free soil laws are unconstitutional. The Missouri Compromise, in effect, was unconstitutional.
For the first time since Marbury versus Madison, the United States Supreme Court struck down an act of Congress. For the first time in 54 years, the court exercised the power of judicial review against the national government to protect slavery.
It was a disaster. It was the worst opinion ever written in the history of the Supreme Court of the United States, and solved nothing.
For more on landmark cases, the personalities behind the robes, and significant moments in Supreme Court history, visit pbs.org. The Supreme Court series is available on DVD for $79.99. A companion book is available for $25 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
From 1861 to 1865, Americans spilled precious blood over questions that had divided the nation and tormented the Supreme Court: slavery, states' rights, and federal powers. Swaths of the South were laid to waste in the Civil War. families on both sides destroyed. Old ways of life, old certainties were swept away. Nearly every American was somehow changed by that war, including the men who would shape the Supreme Court from Reconstruction to the New Deal. Even as the war raged, a maverick 46-year-old California judge named Stephen J. Field was elevated to the Supreme Court by President Abraham Lincoln, who needed to keep the nation's richest state tethered to the Union. John Marshall Harlan, a pro-slavery and pro-union lawyer from the border state of Kentucky, was forced to choose a side. And 19-year-old Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. signed on to fight with the Massachusetts 20th. He would never be the same.
Holmes went into the Civil War as a great idealist. He was a dedicated abolitionist. He believed that the war was being fought for the freedom of black people.
It was a chivalric mission. That was the way they described it. They thought of themselves as a species of knights going on a crusade. And then he gets down there and he realizes this is very far from being a crusade.
There were hundreds and hundreds of regiments in the Civil War. The Massachusetts 20th, I think, was maybe the 5th of all of these hundreds and hundreds in terms of casualties. 5/8 of the soldiers in the regiment were wounded or got killed.
He writes a letter to his mother saying, nearly every man I've liked and admired has been killed. So it's just a carnage for him.
He lost whatever idealism he had going in, certainly took a deep beating in the war, but he speaks very profoundly and very movingly about the beauty of the struggle, the fact that people would rush into battle, that he was rushing into battle on behalf of this idea of union, that men were willingly giving up their lives for that. I think he never got over that. He never understood that fully or could comprehend the mystery of that to him.
The one thing that he did come away with, and it also becomes a key to his jurisprudence, is the sort of nobility of the struggle. It's the struggle that counts.
The carnage that Oliver Wendell Holmes had witnessed was only a small window on the enormity of the Civil War. When it was over, 600,000 men had perished. But the Union held, and the Constitution, like the nation, was reborn.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments together, but above all the 14th Amendment, is the fruit of the Civil War. It is what all those brave men fought for and died for.
The 14th Amendment says the federal government is going to protect your citizenship even in your state. The federal government is going to protect you against your own state. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States.
The thing about the 14th Amendment is it's written in general terms. It's not couched in racial terms. It's not couched in gender terms. It's couched in universal terms. Citizens have privileges and immunities. People have rights to equal protection and due process. So while it is historically tied to the Reconstruction Acts of the time, the language of the 14th Amendment admits of a broader range of interpretation.
If the intended beneficiaries of the amendment were open-ended, the benefits themselves were maddeningly vague. What are the privileges or immunities of citizenship? What fundamental rights comprise liberty? How far could the federal government go to secure for citizens equal protection of the law? For the next 70 years, as a rollicking new nation rose from the ash of war, it would fall to the Supreme Court to attach specific meaning and substance to those arguable 14th Amendment phrases. The task would swell the influence of the court and invite remarkable judicial creativity. By the time the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, the Supreme Court had a new home. It still didn't have its own building, but met in the old Senate chamber in the Capitol, where it conducted its business in the shadow of the forceful new post-war Congress. The The 14th Amendment gave Congress explicit powers to enforce the rights of former slaves in even the most resistant rebel states. And the Republican-controlled Congress exercised those powers during Reconstruction, installing federal troops in the South and passing laws that guaranteed blacks access to public education, the right to serve on juries, testify in court, and vote in elections.
People began to sort of go about trying to make themselves into citizens with the backing of the federal government, they thought. People were flooding to get married, to try to do all of the things that were denied to them during slavery. People bought property thinking that their property would be protected, tried to start businesses, tried to get education. This is a new covenant.
Voter rolls filled with former slaves. Hundreds of black candidates won political office in the 1870 elections. And when the white backlash in the South turned lethal, Congress made a show of strength, enacting legislation to protect blacks from Klansmen and other vigilante groups. In 1875, even as white resistance hardened and former Confederates began to take back power in the southern states, radical Republicans in Congress passed a sweeping Civil Rights Act.
The most important provisions are the ones dealing with access to public accommodations. Places of public accommodation are named places of public accommodation for a reason. They're generally open to the public. Theaters, hotels, restaurants, railroad transportation, and it provides for full and equal access without regard to race.
In 1883, that law was challenged. The case, besides rewriting the nation's long-running racial drama, would produce the Supreme Court's first great dissent, and its first great dissenter. The civil rights cases was a consolidation of 5 separate cases that spanned the country. Owners had been fined or indicted for denying black citizens seats at hotels in Kansas and Missouri, a seat on a ladies' car of a Southern railroad. The owners wanted the law under which they'd been prosecuted struck down. Much had changed in the 8 years since the law's passage. Even in the North, people had grown weary of Reconstruction. Radical Republicans had lost control of Congress and the Southern state houses. Federal troops had been pulled from the old Confederacy. Members of the court had no problem gauging the force and direction of the political winds. As Joseph Bradley's majority opinion circulated among the justices, 8 of the 9 signed on.
The Supreme Court in 1883 strikes down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and what the court says is the 14th Amendment prohibits a state from denying equal protection. Individual behavior does not offend the Constitution, and the federal government doesn't get to come in and fix this problem.
The court took the view that the 14th Amendment gave no protection from private discrimination. The landlord could exclude you from renting his house. The innkeeper could exclude you from the inn. The theater could exclude you from the theater. The 14th Amendment said no state shall. It didn't say no landlady, no innkeeper, no theater manager.
The opinion ends with Justice Bradley saying, there comes a time when, after the emergence of slavery, a person must take on the role of mere citizen and cease being a special favorite of the law. And what the court is announcing then is, Reconstruction's over. You're just like anyone else.
There was only one justice who refused to join the majority. He was a starch-collared fundamentalist Presbyterian and former slaveholder from Kentucky named John Marshall Harlan. He was the only justice who'd seen slavery and Reconstruction up close. As Attorney General of Kentucky just after the Civil War, Harlan had been a vocal opponent of the 13th and 14th Amendments. He'd been among the office holders who stirred white rage against freed slaves. In Harlan's hometown of Frankfort alone, there were 64 cataloged acts of white supremacist terror against freed blacks and their political allies. When Harlan saw the bitter fruit of his politics, he'd been shamed.
Even though he was raised as a white supremacist, raised as a slaveholder, at the same time, he firmly believed that his father had been an honorable white man, that he had never abused power. That may be a myth, but that's what he believed, and he wanted to live up to that kind of honor. And so people threw his history back in his face, and he said, "I would rather be right than consistent."
The northern members of the court could talk in generalities about how the freedmen had become equal in the eyes of the law and no longer needed the special help of the federal government. But Harlan knew better. He knew the predicament that blacks faced in the South. And he knew that civil rights could not be protected simply with the abstractions of the language of equality, that civil rights required the federal government to give the aid that was necessary.
Harlan determined to dissent in the civil rights cases, and to dissent loudly. But once he began to write, he found himself paralyzed, until his wife pulled from storage a strange memento the Harlans had bought. The inkstand Chief Justice Roger Taney had used to write his infamous Dred Scott decision, a decision in which he observed that blacks had no rights a white man was bound to respect.
She cleaned it, she filled it with ink, and she put it on his desk so that when he came home from church one Sunday, it was sitting there. And in effect, what she was reminding her husband was that the Dred Scott case needed to be undone.
Harlan's dissent in the civil rights cases says, "We, the court, protected the rights of slave masters and upheld congressional laws protecting slave masters. And now, when the Constitution has been amended to protect the rights of former slaves, we're striking down congressional laws designed to enforce that right. We are not treating the former slaves with the same kind of generosity that we once treated slave masters. And that's hypocrisy."
Harlan is that one voice on the court that still embodies that previous commitment that was made just a few years earlier to that goal, to the goal of racial equality. But the rest of the country and the court had moved on.
The country doesn't want to continue with this experiment in coerced reform of race relations in the South, and I think the Supreme Court's basically putting its stamp of approval on that. They're saying the national government is not going to intervene anymore in Southern race relations. We are restoring home rule on the race issue to the South. We're going to return to the status quo, which is upper-class whites in the South get to decide what race relations are going to look like.
You're moving from the period where people would wave the bloody shirt of the Civil War to try to reinforce sectional cleavages to an America that is being brought together, regardless of section, by ribbons of highways, ribbons of railroad tracks, telegraph lines. The country is changing, so what was once so strongly disunited was becoming united, and what's unifying that country, at least at this stage of the game, is not so much the central government, but it's the economy. And private actors, the Goulds, for example, the Rockefellers, the robber barons. These are people who are creating a national economy based on sort of a rootin' tootin' capitalism.
From the 1870s into the 1930s, as 1,000 local markets were welded together, the wealth of the nation surged. Gross national product grew into the tens of billions. The population swelled toward 100 million and spread west. The national government stood back and watched as the engines of new industries shuddered to life, and new conflicts emerged.
From the elite perspective, this is a system that is enhancing liberty, that is enhancing wealth, that is enhancing an idea of America that is pulling it into maturity as a nation. And anything that gets in the way of that endangers both that maturity and also the liberty on which the country was founded.
The country is really divided between people who want to promote a national economy and all the competition and laissez-faire associated with the national economy, and those who wanted to regulate that economy, people who thought that that economy that was developing was imposing some burdens on workers and farmers, and that it was the obligation of government to try to mitigate some of those problems. The court is placed in the middle of those battles.
From the beginning of the set to over government involvement in the economy, one energetic voice rose above all others on the court. It was the voice of Justice Stephen J. Field. Field's constitutional vision was formed in the fresh beginnings of the Far West. Born to wealth and power in Massachusetts, Field had taken his lawyer's shingle and followed the 49ers into the wilds of California, where he and thousands of other individuals were free to invent a new state from scratch. In just 15 years, the 49ers had turned this virgin land into a place of high finance, industrial might, and fabulous wealth. The growth of empire that the Revolutionary War generation had envisioned, Field had witnessed on the nation's farthest shores. When Stephen J. Field took his seat on the court, he meant to protect the possibilities of economic expansion wherever Americans lived. The key was keeping private property clear of government meddling. And Congress itself had given Justice Field a tool to do just that, the 14th Amendment.
Field thought that the language of the amendment made it very clear. For the first time in the country's history, the federal Constitution limited the states in their ability to interfere with people's liberty and property.
Field saying private property is sanctified in America. If government impinges on private property, no longer do you have free government and a free people.
For 25 years, in case after case, Field pressed his argument for near absolute economic liberty. He was convinced that state legislators were easily corrupted, that state regulation of private enterprise was most likely an effort to favor one competitor over another. If a state regulation was challenged in the Supreme Court, Field nearly always voted to strike it down. He often lost, but never flagged, and never backed down. And by 1890, the court had begun to tack around to Field, because pro-business presidents had filled the bench with like-minded lawyers, including Field's own nephew, David Brewer. By that time, a new civic religion had taken hold in America. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection had evolved from scientific to social theory. Political philosopher Herbert Spencer's pungent term, the survival of the fittest, was in the air.
Social Darwinism is coming to the fore. Herbert Spencer, social statics, the notion that the fittest will survive and that life is about competition. The economy is about competition as well. And so if government gets involved and imposes its interests on the economy, then those who are naturally strongest won't necessarily win because the referee will get involved in the game and bias the outcome of the game. Which means that not only is the outcome biased, but that the best does not prevail.
John D. Rockefeller is supposed to have taught Sunday school. And one of the lessons that he apparently taught his young charges had to do with this justification of this new competitive environment, which his own corporation embodied, of course, which at times was quite ruthless. And he said, you know, it's like the American beauty rose, that in order to get the splendor of this rose, you have to prune the buds off. And if it appears to be cruel, that labor is suppressed, that competitors are eliminated ruthlessly, then this is the price you pay for economic progress.
The typical workday for a man was 10 hours, possibly 12. The typical workday for women workers was 12 hours or 14 hours. And in this new industrial economy, people worked 6 days a week.
You could work hard all day long and make an impoverishing wage. If you were a factory hand, no matter how hard you worked, you couldn't make enough to support a family.
Women and children were earning wages or earning income to help make the family just live at a subsistence level. The employer's rules held sway in the workplace. It was actually a realm of American life that almost resembled feudalism.
By the 1890s, the divides in the nation had cracked wide. John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were each making more than $10 million a year, tax-free. The average worker made less than $500.
Individuals feel they are increasingly powerless, and they're aggrieved in some sense, and they can't overthrow the source of the problem. They turn to government. It's all an effort to get some entity on your side to work against power that you yourself can't control.
For the first time, Congress stepped in to check the growing power of the owning class. It mandated the breakup of powerful national monopolies, and in 1894 instituted a federal income tax on the richest Americans, 2% on annual income over today's equivalent of $250,000. As the Supreme Court began to consider the constitutionality of this new federal legislation, class resentments boiled over. A worker shutdown at the Pullman Company ignited a national railroad strike. Business-friendly federal judges, such as William Howard Taft, issued injunctions to put a stop to it. Railroad owners convinced the president to call out the U.S. Army and state militias.
During the Pullman strike, the Army ended up shooting 5 or 6 strikers. And Taft wrote at that time, they're going to have to shoot a lot more of those strikers in order to make the point that they want to make. And that attitude, by the way, was not that unusual. Conservative political leaders at the time really thought that the country was going to get out of hand if these more socialistic tendencies were not brought under control.
What the court decides today, while obviously gripping and part of our culture wars, is chicken feed compared to what the court presided over in the 1890s. The court had in its hands the future of industrial America. Sober, thoughtful Americans, not hysterical people, thought the nation was at the brink of class war.
The justices are responding to this sense of spreading anarchy and social disorder, and they're worried about the socialism and communism and the desire to redistribute wealth. They're worried about property rights.
When the court sat in 1895, Stephen J. Field was nearing 80, barely able to haul himself up the steps of the Capitol. But his fingers could not be pried from the standard he'd held for over 30 years.
He's talking about getting a shot of carbolic acid in his knee and how it was so painful that he thought he would pass out and that he really might die at any point, but he was struggling to hold on because it was absolutely vital to the safety of the nation that he participate in this decision. So Justice Field sees himself as doing heroic service to the country by struggling to hold on to his seat on the Supreme Court to strike down the income tax.
Stephen J. Field thought that the income tax was the thin edge of the wedge of communism. And these kinds of laws had to be stopped, or the United States would just cease to be a place of liberty, and instead would be a place where the poor thought up laws in order to take money away from the rich.
The court majority sent a powerful message in the last years of the 19th century. It would safeguard private property owners from intrusions by both federal and state government. The court had finally bought into Field's vision of the 14th Amendment. While the majority refused to use the amendment to protect broad social and political rights for blacks or Chinese or women, it would use the amendment as a nearly impenetrable shield to protect private property rights. In 1897, Stephen J. Field bested John Marshall's record 34-year tenure on the court, then grudgingly stepped aside.
He doesn't leave the court the way he entered the court, as a cranky dissenter trying to tell everyone the right path. By the time Field leaves the court, his dissents had been vindicated.
So Field leaves the court at the end of the 19th century, but Field's ideas carry through well into the next century.
"5 years after Stephen Field's retirement, with his ideas still in full flower, a new kind of justice arrived at the court. By the time he was appointed in 1902, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. had already distinguished himself as Civil War officer, Harvard Law professor, author of renowned works of legal scholarship, and Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Even at the advanced age of 61, Holmes was a fresh wind blowing into the musty old Senate chamber where the court had sat for 40 years.
The old stalwarts, Justice Brewer, Justice Peckham, and even the Chief Justice Melvin Fuller, are all deeply religious men. They're convinced that the economic liberties that they've begun to read into the Constitution were handed down by the Lord and a part of natural justice.
Oliver Wendell Holmes, on the other hand, did not believe in natural law. He was an agnostic, and he believed that any system of rights that existed in the world was the creation of people, of human beings. There were no God-given rights. We were making this up on our own.
He came out and said, all judges inevitably bring to the cases they are hearing their prejudices, their ideas. He's telling the country, watch out for these judges. Me too, me included.
There is the story of this young man who essentially asks Holmes, you know, how come you're such a great man, or something like that. And Holmes is supposed to have said, young man, I decided long ago that I wasn't God.
Just 3 years into Holmes's tenure, a case came before the court that highlighted stark divisions among the justices, drawing the battle lines for a quarrel that would play out over the next 30 years. And Oliver Wendell Holmes girded up for the second big fight of his life. In 1897, the state of New York had passed a law limiting the number of hours bakers could be required to work. And when Utica bakery owner Joseph Lochner refused to abide by the law, he was twice convicted, fined $50, and ordered to jail until he paid up. Instead of paying, Lochner challenged the maximum hours law, forcing a fight that finished in the United States Supreme Court. When the case finally landed in the old Senate chamber in 1905, New York defended its law. States had been ceded police power to ensure the public health and safety of their citizens. But the court struck down the New York State maximum hours law.
In Lochner, which is a law that imposed a maximum 60 hours a week for bakers to work, Peckham asks, well, does this law have anything to do with health? And he concludes, no, it doesn't have anything to do with health. Bread is bread. And while bakers die younger than others, somebody's got to die first. Therefore, the law isn't part of the police power. Instead, it is trying to regulate the employer-employee relationship, and this is not subject to the police power. This is the liberty of contract that individuals have the right to engage in.
What the court's saying is that when government tells me that I can't work 80 hours a week as a baker, government is infringing on my liberty to contract my labor. Government is infringing on me as a person, telling me what I can do with myself.
Liberty of contract was an idea straight from Stephen J. Field, teased from the soft phrases of the 14th Amendment. It went to the heart of free market ideals. When employers and employees were negotiating terms of a contract, government almost always had to stay clear. That laborers might not have the same leverage as owners was unfortunate, but not within government's power to fix.
Where does this liberty of contract get? Where does the court find it in the Constitution? They find it in the Due Process Clause, which says government shall not deprive people of life, liberty, or property without due process. And the court says included in that liberty protection is a right for liberty of contract. It's a very creative reading. It's basically a made-up doctrine. There's a lot of pressure on judges to reach results that they regard as just, and they're willing to stretch and strain with the text if necessary. And in 1973, a lot of judges felt like a woman's right to abortion was pretty important, and the court found it in the Constitution. In 1905, a lot of people thought that a right to contract was important, and the court found it in the Constitution.
John Marshall Harlan, joined by 2 other justices, dissented in Lochner. The state of New York had presented compelling facts as to the health hazard to bakers. That was good enough for him. Oliver Wendell Holmes, acting alone, made a more sweeping dissent, a frontal assault on judicial activism.
Holmes says, We, the judges, are imposing our policy views on the nation as a whole when we do this. We talk about liberty of contract, we talk about property, we have all these words, but in fact what's going on here is you don't like this legislation. You think this is bad for the country. You may be right, he says, but our job is not to decide whether it's good or bad for the country. It's to decide what do the people of this country want. And New York State can go to hell in a handbasket as far as I'm concerned in its public policy, but my job is to see that it gets there.
Holmes did not do this because he had great faith in American politicians. He called them the thick-fingered clowns at one time. He was not a reformer. He was not necessarily in favor of the rights of labor. He just felt that if in this struggle which is going on between interest groups, between labor and capital, if labor wins one and they get a victory in the New York legislature, then who are the judges to make up this stuff in the 14th Amendment and strike him down?
Like all justices of his day, Holmes did his real work at home. He wrote his first famous dissent in his personal library, surrounded by the guiding stars of his life. On his shelves were well-thumbed books by Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, and his hero Malthus, whose ideas inspired the theory of natural selection. In Holmes's closet were battle-torn relics of his war. "These uniforms were worn by me in the Civil War," said a note pinned to them, "and the stains upon them are my blood."
He was in rebellion against the certitudes as a result of the war. The one thing that he did come away with, and it also becomes a key to his jurisprudence, is the sort of nobility of the struggle. He said it was our great good fortune to be on that generation that fought this war, and what we learned was that whether you're given by destiny a spade and you dig, or whether you get an axe and you scale the ice, he said, the one true thing you bring to it is a great heart.
Holmes is a skeptic without becoming a cynic, which is, I think, what, to me, is endearing about him in a way. He didn't think anybody knew how to make society better, but he was deeply respectful of the people who were struggling to do so.
The struggle between capital and labor was the ferocious fight during Holmes's years on the court. Capital held the high ground, but progressive reformers kept pushing for maximum hours and minimum wage laws to ease the daily burden on workers. They wanted limits on child labor and the right of workers to form unions and bargain as a collective. Holmes's personal allegiance lay with capital, and he didn't think any reform would much help the working classes. But when progressives managed to get laws passed that squeezed owners, Justice Holmes refused to strike them down, unless they were unarguably unconstitutional. Now and then he gathered a majority for upholding reasonable regulation. But Holmes made few reliable converts among his fellow justices, and he would occasionally turn his biting wit on his colleagues. Holmes had grown particularly weary of John Marshall Harlan's moralizing, but an uncharacteristic sentimentality seeped out of Holmes on the news of Harlan's death. The old boy had outlived his usefulness, Holmes wrote, but he was a figure the like of which I shall not see again.
When he died, the black community of Washington was quite saddened, and the African Methodist Episcopalian Church actually had a memorial service for him. And in the program, there's a photograph of Harlan, and on it says, "A true friend of the people." And they played Beethoven's On the Death of a Hero.
In his own home, and sometimes out of it, he was charming, Holmes noted. "On my 70th birthday, who but he bethought to put a little bunch of violets on my desk in court?" Peace to his ashes. By 1912, the great stalwarts of liberty of contract, Brewer, Peckham, and Fuller, had all given up the ghost too. But President William Howard Taft reloaded the court with justices also willing to strike down state and federal laws that intruded on the free market economy. Holmes's only sure ally in the cause of judicial modesty was a Woodrow Wilson appointee, Louis Brandeis, who in 1916 became the first Jewish member of the court.
Holmes and Brandeis were the great dissenting duo of the progressive era, and they're forever linked together as Holmes and Brandeis, but they were entirely different men. Holmes approved of progressive legislation because he didn't care. Brandeis was righteous, he was zealous, he was passionate about the issues of his time. Holmes hated facts. If you read a Holmes opinion, there are almost no facts in it. Contrasted with a Brandeis opinion, Brandeis is just going to roll you over with facts.
One summer, Holmes was going on vacation in the summer. And Brandeis said, "Hey, Oliver Wendell, why don't you learn about the garment industry? Remember, you can read up on the garment industry." And Holmes sort of, you can see him rolling his eyes like, "Lovely, that's my summer reading."
One fact mattered most to Justice Holmes: the head count. He acceded, almost without exception, to the will of the political majority. When the state of Virginia authorized the forced sterilization of a young woman named Carrie Buck, Holmes authored the decision that upheld it, noting that Miss Buck, her mother, and her daughter were all feeble-minded.
Now, there are problems both with his facts and with his law. Carrie Buck was probably not feeble-minded. The reason she was identified as feeble-minded was she was unmarried, and she was a teenager, and she'd gotten pregnant.
We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives, Holmes wrote in his opinion. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Well, maybe Holmes's judicial philosophy didn't make him a sterling symbol of human sympathy. But besides Brandeis, Holmes was about the best hope the progressives had. And support for the progressive movement was being washed away.
The economic boom that takes the United States out of the First World War period and telescopes into the 1920s is enormous. And so, if you're sitting on the Supreme Court as a defender of liberty of contract, you're saying, this is the America that we can have if we just keep government out. If you protect property, you get enormous wealth. You get cars. You get an industrial base which is second to none. You get exports of goods. You get accumulation of wealth and dispersion of wealth.
Nobody had to convince former President William Howard Taft, who took over as Chief Justice in 1921. Taft was soon joined by George Sutherland and Pierce Butler, who along with Willis Van Deventer and James McReynolds would come to be known as the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. In 1923, the 4 Horsemen made a clear statement about government's power to insert itself into the employer-employee relationship, pushing the court toward a hands-off doctrine that made even Taft blush. 5 years earlier, the District of Columbia had appointed a board to hold hearings and find a fair minimum wage to be paid to women and children. Employers and employees brought suit, challenging the right of any government to say what workers would be paid. In Adkins versus Children's Hospital, over another loud objection from Holmes, the court struck down the minimum wage law.
The court said, hey, if a woman is getting a minimum wage, it means that she would have been willing to work for less. And the difference between that minimum wage and what she would have been willing to work with is a forced extraction from the employer to her. And therefore, it violates due process of law. He wants to pay less, and he should have the right to do so.
Justice Sutherland noted that in 2 prior cases, the court had sustained a maximum hours law for women on account of their special needs, and then a maximum hours law for both men and women. So it was assumed Lochner was dead. He said, no, Lochner is very important. Lochner is alive. She was deprived the liberty of contract, clearly, which she is entitled to.
The court was little criticized for its creativity or its activism. Its prestige was at a peak. In 1929, Chief Justice Taft convinced Congress to appropriate $10 million for the Supreme Court to have a building of its own. The cornerstone was laid in 1932. That same year, Oliver Wendell Holmes retired at age 91. He was still in the minority on the question of government's power to regulate the economy. In 30 years on the bench, he had been unable to break the spell of Stephen J. Field. Liberty of contract still held sway. But Oliver Wendell Holmes, the old skeptic whose youthful idealism had been buried among the corpses of Civil War dead, had not lost heart. "As I grow older, I grow calm," Holmes had written. "I think it not improbable that man, like the grub that prepares a chamber for the winged thing it has never seen but is to be, may have destinies that he does not understand." By the time Oliver Wendell Holmes died in 1935, the United States Supreme Court seemed to have realized its own great destiny. After 145 years of renting space from the Senate, the court moved into a home of its own. The new surroundings, 4 resplendent stories of white oak and mahogany, Spanish, Italian, and African marble, carved friezes and Corinthian columns, suggested permanence and strength. But even as the marbled walls were being built around the court, a storm was gathering outside it, a storm that would challenge the court's cherished and long-held certainties.
By the early 30s, the court, the 9 old men, found itself sitting at the top of a situation in which an unregulated economy lay in ruins at its feet.
Reserve, protect, and defend. When Franklin Roosevelt is inaugurated, there's 25% unemployment in the United States.
Our greatest primary task is to put.
And in his inaugural address, the chief applause line is when he says he may be forced to assume powers ordinarily taken only in time of war.
He envisioned a much more muscular federal government and legislation that would practically grab the autonomy by its ears and pull it out of the Depression.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
From the beginning of his first term, Franklin Roosevelt rolled up his sleeves and stuck his hands where no president ever had, in the whirring mechanisms of the national economy. With the help of Congress, the Roosevelt administration undertook to increase farm income and wages, to push down prices, and to create jobs. Nobody would argue that things were great, but the federal government had put its shoulder to the wheel.
Citizens saw what the federal government could do in the early years of the New Deal. And so people's expectations about what government could do began to rise.
The court had to know that the New Deal had extraordinary popular support. Congress would do anything Roosevelt wanted. He's got the presidency, he's got the support of the people, and the government was exercising powers that had never been exercised in American history. And the justices can see Hitler has taken over in Germany and centralized things. Mussolini is running Italy and centralizing things. Stalin is running Russia and centralizing things. And now we have a government where the president has suggested, well, maybe the Constitution isn't all that it should be, and I want to have wartime powers. And the justices were worried about this. Are we seeing a constitutional revolution without a change in the Constitution? The only conceivable check on Roosevelt is the judiciary. In 1935 and 1936, the Supreme Court invalidates 10 recent federal statutes. They have never done that before. They have never done that since in a 2-year period.
At the end of that run, in 1936, the court narrowly struck down a New York state minimum wage law. The Supreme Court, led by the Four Horsemen, held that neither the federal government nor state legislatures had the right to meddle in the free market economy, emergency or no.
The rest of the country is widely being affected, feeling the effects of the Great Depression. And the Four Horsemen are hanging on for dear life to this liberty of contract idea.
I defy anyone to read the opinions concerning the AAA, the Railroad Retirement Act, the National Recovery Act, the Guffey Coal Act, and the New York Minimum Wage Law, and tell us exactly what, if anything, we can do for the industrial worker in this session of the Congress with any reasonable certainty that what we do will not be nullified as unconstitutional.
Franklin Roosevelt had big new things to try, and 5 votes on the court could put a stop to any of them. So after the president was re-elected in a landslide in 1936, he went after the conservative old justices. He threatened to create 6 new seats on the bench, fill them with his own men, and thereby give himself a certain majority.
What Roosevelt was indicating to the court was, if you stand in the way, I'm simply going to finish you as an institution. And I think the justices understood that.
By 1937, when the case of a hotel maid from Wenatchee, Washington, made it to the splendid new courthouse, Roosevelt's assault had focused the nation's attention on 9 men in black robes. The chambermaid, Elsie Parrish, wasn't asking for the moon. She just wanted the court to award her back pay of $216.19, the difference between the wage the hotel had paid her and the state-mandated minimum. The West Coast hotel attorneys were unapologetic. Of course the corporation had been paying the maid less than the minimum of $14.50 a week. It had the right to do so under the liberty of contract doctrine. The Four Horsemen all but nodded in agreement. But when the West Coast decision came down on March 29, 1937, Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes's preamble caught the attention of everyone listening in. The economic conditions, he said, make it not only appropriate, but we think imperative, that in deciding the present case, the subject should receive fresh consideration. Hughes announced that the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, was upholding the Washington state minimum wage law. The working woman, Elsie Parrish, would get her due.
West Coast Hotel versus Parrish was the court's surrender to the New Deal. Chief Justice Hughes, in that opinion, says people have to live. They have to have the necessities of life. And the public doesn't have to subsidize an unscrupulous employer who is exploiting his employees.
That case has sometimes been referred to as ushering in what is known as the constitutional revolution of 1937. The court was acknowledging the legitimate role that government would play in helping people who were not competing successfully in the market.
When the court switches in 1937, they basically say, we will get out of the way and let the train come through. Government can regulate as it chooses.
The Revolution of 37 was explicitly Holmesian in some ways. They stand back, they let the New Deal proceed, and I think there were contemporaneous reports at the time of people saying, Holmes must be chuckling in his grave now. This is just what he was telling the court to do 20 years ago, and now they're finally doing it.
Holmes had said in these economic areas, the court should restrain itself. Let the people work it out. Let the legislatures work it out. Let the interest in society fight it out. But let's don't intervene. And essentially that's what the court did. It pulled back from the whole field of economic regulation, and it made Holmes into quite a prophet.
The court essentially quit one job without yet having a new job identified. The challenge of the court after 1937 was to figure out how to rethink its role in the political system. Could it find a role that was appropriate for a new age?
For more on landmark cases, the personalities behind the robes, and significant moments in Supreme Court history, visit pbs.org. The Supreme Court series is available on DVD for $79.99. A companion book is available for $25 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
Yes, it's wonderful, but people are going to die.
New freedoms bring new perils.
Segregation now, segregation forever.
And an unlikely champion arises.
Why did they write the Bill of Rights? Practically all of them make it more difficult to convict people of crime.
It's a time of great social upheaval, and the court will lead the way.
We really have a remade idea of individual rights and civil liberties in America.
This time on the Supreme Court.
The Second World War changed America in every way. It cast Americans as defenders of liberty worldwide, at a time when 6 newly appointed justices were just beginning to find their way on the Supreme Court.
It's a time of a rising sense of defending the values of Western civilization. In a sense, defending the product of the Enlightenment against the totalitarian hordes that Hitler represented.
The United States enters this war against fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism. And what happens in the course of that engagement was that America begins to define itself in terms of that conflict.
The war changed American ideas on individual liberty and government power. It showed a whole generation the wider world, and convinced that generation there was nothing America couldn't do. The most powerful nation the world had ever seen, and because of our freedoms, because of our rights. Over the next quarter century, that belief would push the nation and its Supreme Court to a new agenda, onto unexplored terrain.
This is a watershed time in the court's history. You have World War II, you have McCarthyism, you have the Cold War, you have the civil rights struggles. There's tension between national security, national identity, free speech, individual rights. And it falls into the lap of these 9 justices to sort it all out. They don't move in a straight line, they move in fits and starts, they have to backtrack, but eventually we really have a remade court and a remade idea of individual rights and civil liberties in America.
This new idea, a nation of liberties, would find an unlikely champion. Justice Hugo Black was a prickly man, certain of his own rectitude. He was among the most driven men to ever sit on the United States Supreme Court, but he called himself just an old hillbilly from Clay County, Alabama.
Oh, it was a world that we can barely associate with today. Isolated Alabama hill country. People were considered worldly if they went outside the county. And as a kid, he went to the only real entertainment there was. And that entertainment was the courtroom, up in the Clay County courthouse.
Hugo Black never finished high school or college. He got himself admitted to the University of Alabama Law School, but he mostly taught himself the law, along with everything else. He'd read nearly a book a day for more than 50 years. He wanted to know everything. Ambition was the other constant. By his late 20s, he'd made himself a famous trial lawyer in Birmingham, then for a couple of years, a crusading prosecutor.
He was enormously successful. He once estimated that he had over 2,000 trials, and he remembered losing about 20. He would cry when he was in a courtroom if necessary. He could manufacture crying, although he would always qualify it. Hugo Black doesn't cry for less than $25,000.
Black turned his dramatically won courtroom reputation to political capital, with one giant, somewhat surprising leap into the United States Senate. By 1937, he was in his second term, champion of the little guy, and a spur for radical New Deal policies, when FDR plucked him for the court.
FDR drops a bombshell. Hugo Black, an anomaly, an intellectual leftist liberal from the South. You couldn't dream it up, but this was only the first of several things we couldn't dream up. Black was confirmed by the Senate handily, 63-16, takes a long delayed trip to Europe.
As Black sailed for Europe, a reporter left Pittsburgh to investigate rumors that had been whispered about at Black's confirmation. It was a long shot, a northern newspaperman trying to penetrate the secrets of the society that ruled the South. But he got his story.
Tell us, Justice Black, are you a member of the Ku Klux Klan?
Wait, what's he supposed to say to that for?
The ex-senator ducks a direct answer and refuses to commit himself to the press.
Of course he was a member. It was the only way he can get elected. Without the Klan, he would have been a minor candidate with very little money. It was his campaign organization in every way except name. After all, most people's neighbors, one side or the other, were members. 15,000 of the 32,000 white men in Birmingham were members of that Klan unit.
He would go to Klan meetings, he would speak, he would put on the regalia. He would march in some of their parades or their demonstrations, so he was a fairly active member.
Crossed swords lay on the Bible on the altar, and he read the oath. I swear that I will most zealously and valiantly shield and preserve by any and all justifiable means and methods white supremacy.
Ladies and gentlemen, an effort is being made to convince the people of America that I am intolerant and that I am prejudiced. These insinuations...
He would make one statement, a radio address, holed up at a friend's house in the suburbs of Washington. This would be the summation in his greatest trial, his own, and before the grandest jury. The audience for Hugo Black's speech would be the second largest in history, behind only the abdication of King Edward VIII.
Intolerance. I number among my friends many members of the colored race. Certainly, they are entitled to the full measure of protection accorded by our Constitution and our laws. I did join the Klan. I later resigned. I never rejoined.
He never denounced the Klan. He never gave a reason why he joined and why he resigned. He says, I have no problems with Jews or African Americans. I count them as my friends, and that was it.
He could not come up with a good reason why he joined the Klan. The only reason, politics, was too obvious, too crude. The joke in Washington was that he wouldn't have to buy a new robe. He can dye his white one black.
President Roosevelt ignored the calls for Justice Black's resignation, and Black stood his ground. He wasn't going anywhere. But the question remained, would Justice Hugo Black be willing to protect the rights of all? There would be no quick answer, because in the 1940s, outside of economic liberties, the court had almost no history on protection of individual rights. It started with children who were kicked out of school, because in the run-up to war, the schools were at work building patriotism. In Minersville, Pennsylvania, all kids had to salute the flag.
There were two little kids there, Lillian Gobitis and William Gobitis. Lillian was 12, William was 10. They were Jehovah's Witnesses, and it was against their religious faith to pay homage in any way to the flag. The Minersville School District said no exceptions, and these children were expelled.
So their parents brought suit on the basis of their religious freedom. And they won at the lower courts. And then it came up to the Supreme Court of the United States.
It was a brand new Supreme Court, remade by 5 fresh Roosevelt appointees. Black was the first, but the ornament and leading light was to be Felix Frankfurter. He might have been the most famous lawyer in the country, a towering figure in Roosevelt's brain trust. He was an immigrant, an Austrian boy who landed on Ellis Island at age 12, without a word of English. But he dazzled everybody who saw him since, from the Lower East Side to Harvard Law School and beyond.
Everybody assumed that Frankfurter would become the leader of the liberal wing of the court. He was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union. He was an early supporter of the NAACP. He defended Sacco and Vanzetti, the two immigrant anarchists. He advised Wilson. He advised Franklin Roosevelt when he was governor of New York. And of course, he became almost a one-man employment agency for the New Deal. They were called Frankfurter's hot dogs.
Some jurists come to this court hat in hand. Frankfurter swaggered in. He expected to sweep the court along, and he did. He wrote the flag salute opinion for an 8-to-1 majority and dismissed the plea of the Gobitis children with magisterial certainty.
What he says is that maybe the policy isn't one that he would agree with, but the states, legislatures, school districts have the right to enact it.
It's a theme he struck again and again on the court, and that is it was really the theme of judicial restraint. As long as the legislative and executive branches acted reasonably, the court ought to find their actions constitutional.
In this case, as in most others, Frankfurter thought democracy should run its course. If the majority elected a school board and the school board wanted a flag salute, then everybody must salute.
It's not that he didn't recognize the value of individual liberty, but he thought that fundamentally the freedom of the people had to be protected through democratic institutions and not through court-imposed settlements. It's an ethic that is extremely deferential to democratic outcomes, but it turns out that the democracy isn't always as protective of people's rights and liberties as we would like to think.
Real people had to pay the price for the court's deference. In this case, Jehovah's Witnesses paid dearly. The Gobitis kids had to be sent away when the family was threatened by vigilantes.
When this ruling comes down in 1940, the Jehovah's Witnesses are being pulled out of their homes, pulled from their cars, literally tarred and feathered, pushed to do humiliating things like kiss the flag, forced to drink castor oil, and paraded tied up through the streets of these small towns. There was one incident of somebody being kidnapped and castrated, and newspapers across the country were outraged by what happened.
Shortly after that, Black, Douglas, and Murphy wrote basically saying they were wrong, and Gobitis.
Black and his fellow justices almost advertised for another flag salute case, and got one in 1943. In Barnett versus West Virginia, the vote was 6-3 for the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the court held the decision to announce on Flag Day, to signal that a major shift was underway.
And 1943 is one of the first times in the history of the court that the justices come together and embrace a vision of the Constitution that judges could enforce against the political system in the protection of civil rights and liberties. And that transformation is key not only to changing the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's key to changing the country as a whole.
Frankfurter was left in lone dissent, to rage against the majority that had abandoned him. What reason is there to believe that they, or their successors, may not have another view a few years hence, Frankfurter wrote? Is the Constitution to be the sport of shifting winds of doctrine? Frankfurter wasn't much judge of character. Hugo Black wasn't about shifting winds or fashions. Where he saw what he thought was a clear limit in the Constitution, no power, not the government's, not even a Democratic majority, could overrule that limit.
Black's argument is that the Constitution limits the power of government over individual citizens. The limits are defined by the Bill of Rights.
From his point of view, his job was to take the literal language of the Constitution and apply it as it was written. In many respects, Black is bringing to his analysis that kind of biblical authority of the importance of the text that he grew up with as a child in Alabama.
As the Bible is the holy word of God, from this tradition, Black and others like him see the Constitution as the holy word of the framers. And that must bind.
Even if there were only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
This microfilm was made for the purpose of transmitting State Department documents to the Soviet Union.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
The country as a whole is in the middle of the McCarthy scare. There are concerns about China going communist. There is the Korean War. There's a general sense that in this battle between America and communism that we are under siege. And there's a lot of panic in the country.
In New York City, federal authorities charged the leaders of the American Communist Party with violations of the Smith Act.
The Smith Act makes it a crime for people to advocate the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. But there was no accusation that they were actually engaged in a conspiracy to actually overthrow the U.S. government.
What these 11 American communist leaders had done, so far as the trial record showed, was that they had taught Marxist-Leninist doctrine. Well, under the Smith Act, they were convicted for conspiring to advocate the forcible overthrow of the government. Black had been building on his notion that the freedom of expression was a preferred guarantee under the Bill of Rights. For Black, the First Amendment was really the most important because it was the indispensable to our democratic government.
Now, if a man were to say this to me out on the street, Congress shall make no law. That's the First Amendment. I would think, amen, Congress should pass no law.
The court voted 7-2 to sustain the conviction of the communist leaders, Black and William O. Douglas dissenting. And through almost a decade, that became a tagline: hopeful to liberals, hateful to communist hunters. Black and Douglas dissenting.
In his dissent in Dennis, Black says the following: public opinion being what it is now, few will protest the conviction of these communist petitioners. There is hope, however, that in calmer times, when present pressures, passions, and fears subside, this or some later court will restore the First Amendment liberties to the high preferred place where they belong in a free society.
When Black and Douglas stood to defend free speech, they were tagged as communist sympathizers. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover opened secret files on both men. He would later wiretap Black's home phone. Black never complained in public, and he didn't mind writing in dissent. For majority opinions, you might put in language for other justices to keep them on your side. But in dissent, Black could write exactly what he meant, and that might bear fruit in other cases, 5, 10, 15 years later. Black could play the long game. Segregation had been not just custom but law in America for generations. Separate but equal had been blessed by the Supreme Court back in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson. Whites and blacks traveled in separate railroad cars, drank at separate fountains, ate in separate restaurants, attended separate churches, and were buried in separate graveyards. Still, times were changing, and the NAACP lawyers figured they might be able to push the court to change along with them. It was a long shot, but better than waiting on Congress.
The South was not a democracy in the 1950s. Only something like 20% of African Americans were registered to vote in the South. White Democrats in the Senate could filibuster to death any civil rights legislation. That was a pattern all the way from the 1920s to the 1950s. One of the profound ironies of 20th century civil rights history is that the Supreme Court was arguably more Democratic than Congress and the presidency.
By the early 50s, segregation was frayed by the war and torn in spots where the court had acted. The white primary was outlawed. Housing covenants outlawed. Some graduate and law schools were forced to admit blacks. But the court was aware that the big fight was still to come. The schools, K through 12, white children and black in the same classroom.
Southerners assumed that if grade school kids were in a desegregated setting, they'd get to know each other and they'd get to date each other and then they'd marry each other. And that was the strongest taboo that the South held.
Led by Thurgood Marshall and other young lawyers like Robert Carter, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was running or aiding cases all over the country. The court picked 5 and consolidated them into one set of arguments, forever known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. As oral arguments approached, people camped outside the building to assure themselves a seat in the courtroom. NAACP lawyers Marshall and Carter were up against a formidable adversary, John W. Davis, a former presidential candidate making the last of his 140 appearances at the Supreme Court. But his arguments had a familiar ring. Separate wasn't necessarily unequal. Blacks should be happy with the way things were. Didn't states have the right to educate their children as they saw fit? When the 3 days of arguments were over, Davis was heard to remark, "I think we've got it won, 5-4, or maybe 6-3. He figured he had the Chief Justice, Fred Vinson, and his fellow Kentuckian Justice Stanley Reed. The only justices he would give up on for sure were Hugo Black and Bill Douglas. Still, at the conference after the hearing, the justices never got to a vote. It was clear there was doubt and disagreement.
Justice Douglas, in a private memo, said that when the case was first argued, there were only 4 votes to strike down segregation, and there were 5 justices who were not yet prepared to do that. Many of the justices thought segregation was profoundly wrong as a personal matter, as a moral matter. They thought segregation was Hitler's creed. That's how Justice Black once referred to it. But they weren't sure that the law condemned segregation. Precedent was strongly on the side of segregation. Custom had sanctified segregation.
And who was going to enforce it? Congress couldn't do anything about it. Could the president do it alone? Not if the president's Dwight David Eisenhower, who was decidedly lukewarm on overturning separate but equal.
The justices scheduled another hearing on the case. But before that could happen, Chief Justice Vincent died of a heart attack. President Eisenhower chose to nominate Earl Warren, formerly the governor of California. Actually, Ike didn't have any choice. He'd promised Warren the next Supreme Court slot in a deal at the 1952 Republican Convention. It turned out Ike had to make Warren the chief.
There is no reason to believe that Earl Warren is going to be the catalyst for great change constitutionally. He is involved in the Japanese-American relocation. Hell, he's an Eisenhower appointee. This is not somebody who you would look to think the world can change.
The new chief was welcomed by the other great politician on that court. When Warren was new in town, Hugo Black would take him home, open a bottle of scotch, and put some good steaks on the grill. They'd talk about the court all night. Warren asked Black to run the court conferences until he got his feet on the ground. When Warren finally took over the conference, he ran smack into Brown versus Board. None of the justices knew what to expect from the new chief.
It's an interesting way to walk into your job. What he does in this first conference in December of '53 is state the issue as a moral issue. If we uphold Plessy, we're saying that blacks are inferior to whites. Doesn't talk about the legalities of it. Then he just lets it sit.
The issue now was different from the issue the year before when nobody knew what the outcome would be. Now all the justices knew what the outcome would be. The question was what the vote would be.
Warren had to have unanimity. He couldn't expect much help from the White House, and none from Congress. Could the court take on segregation alone? The South would rebel. What army could the court send? And any dissent would become the new anthem. No, the new legal brief for segregation in the South evermore.
The next conference on this is in January. In between, he does what Earl Warren does. He walks halls, he talks to justices, he arranges lunches. I mean, this is the way politicians approach things, and Warren was at core a politician.
He kept them talking week after week and managed to get the court to where it was 8-1, with Stanley Reed being the dissenter. He then went into Reed's office and stated, "Stan, you're in this alone now. You've got to do what's best for the country."
On May 17, 1954, there were signs. Some of the justices' wives showed up. Some clerks were tipped off. Then reporters rushed the courtroom.
Warren starts off in a bland manner, and you can't tell for a while as he's delivering the opinion what the outcome is going to be. And then he comes to the key line and he says, "And we unanimously hold that separate but equal has no place in the Constitution." And it was just electric in the courtroom when he said unanimous.
We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we unanimously hold that the plaintiffs are deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Plessy v. Ferguson in education is no more, and in practice, Plessy v. Ferguson itself is no more. The era of Jim Crow, constitutionally speaking, is over.
This was precisely what we urged them, almost in that language. So it was gratifying to have the opinion come down almost in the language of the argument that we made to them.
In 1951, I'd used a plain geometry book that had been used by a white student in 1935. Brown said that that was over. The hand-me-down tubas that I played in the high school band from the white high schools it said to me that that was ended. And it said to me that at some point, I would not have to travel from Atlanta to Greencastle in Indiana to get an undergraduate degree. That my family, my cousins, my neighbors could go to Georgia Tech and to the University of Georgia. The Supreme Court decision of 1954 was for me the Magna Carta. It was the second emancipation. It was a great moment.
What I did believe was that it would end segregation and discrimination in the country. And what I also believed was that it would provide equality for black people. What I didn't realize, and this comes with experience, is that segregation was a symptom of a larger evil in the society, which is white supremacy.
Black went to a dinner a couple of days later, and all the guests said, "Oh, this is wonderful. Oh, marvelous." A black said, "Yes, it's wonderful, but people are going to die." He had seen at firsthand in the Klan and otherwise in Alabama how raw emotions were and how close to the surface they were. And he said that the tree of liberalism will have to grow with people's blood.
For years after the case, when Black went home to Alabama, he wore a bulletproof vest. Then he stopped going altogether. He was the most reviled native son. In 1959, the state Senate resolved that Black's remains must never be buried in Alabama's sacred soil. By that time, Black's best friends had cut him off. His son, Hugo Jr., had to leave Alabama. He was getting telephone death threats. A crowd tried to burn him an effigy on his front lawn. Meanwhile, schools in Alabama hadn't changed a whit. The decision in Brown had said only that segregation was unconstitutional. A full year and another round of arguments had passed before the court decided how to make its great pronouncement a reality. In the end, all the court's remedies boiled down to one key phrase from the ever-cautious and deferential Felix Frankfurter. Desegregation would proceed with all deliberate speed. Throughout its long history in English and American law, Frankfurter knew, the phrase had always invited a process more deliberate than speedy.
The problem with the all deliberate speed was that it compromised the court's integrity. That was a corrupt decision. When you have a constitutional right, it vests immediately. And what they did with that one was because of race. They said this over time. A racist decision meant, I suppose, to ease the South's acceptance of it. As it turned out, it didn't do that.
How do you boys feel about it?
They don't want no niggers.
No niggers.
No niggers.
They don't want them. No way.
They don't want to come to school. They just want to come and cause trouble.
Do you ever see any prospect, sir, of integrating schools in Prince Edward County?
No, sir. I don't believe it'll come in our lifetime in Prince Edward County.
Prince Edward County simply no longer operates a public school system. In the face of a federal court order to desegregate schools, the county closed up every one of them.
In 1960, which is 5 years after that order came down, 1 in 1,000 school-age African-American kids in the South are attending integrated schools. That's really an extraordinary instance of nullification of a Supreme Court decision.
It wasn't clear what the answer was going to be. There was very little integration and a lot of massive resistance. And the court had to think that our most important pronouncement may be one that the country simply ignores. Segregation won't end, but the court's authority will.
The NAACP's litigation strategy has flopped. The Supreme Court is missing in action. Nothing that the NAACP wins gets any results. And as a result, you get the youthful activists that start the freedom rides in the spring of 1961, that began the sit-in movement in the spring of 1960.
And I say segregation now,
segregation tomorrow and segregation forever.
Brown radicalizes Southern politics. It produces politicians who are more extreme in their commitment to white supremacy.
When Bull Connor, the police commissioner of Birmingham, unleashes the police dogs, the high-pressure fire hydrants, and the cattle prods on peaceful, young African-American dissenters, all of this is beamed to nationwide television, and it takes up all the nightly news.
The effect of the pictures on TV was electric. Civil rights became the nation's agenda. Still, the battle between the new civil rights activists and the white segregationists might have stayed a standoff. Integration might have stalled for another 10 years, except for a third force that was also becoming more hardline.
I regret to announce that Associate Justice Frankfurter has retired from regular active service on the Supreme Court.
Hugo Black's old adversary was gone, and with him, his ideas of judicial restraint. Over the next 5 years, Justice Black would lead the Warren Court to an expansive vision of individual rights. This was his time. With 5 votes, the new liberal majority could do anything it chose. And one thing it chose was to revisit the schools in Prince Edward County, Virginia, one of the 5 original cases in Brown.
This is a profound embarrassment. 13 years after the litigation's begun, the schools are still closed in Prince Edward County, Virginia. Attorney General Robert Kennedy gives a speech in which he says, "Isn't it a shame that the only places in the world where you can't get a free education are in North Vietnam, Cuba, Communist China, and Prince Edward County, Virginia?"
Hugo Black wrote the opinion for the court. There were no dissents. "The time for mere deliberate speed has run out," he wrote, "and that phrase can no longer justify denying these children their constitutional rights."
Black's take on all deliberate speed is angry. He is mad that the South hasn't made a good faith effort.
They order that the schools be reopened, and indeed they order a tax increase to fund public education, which is something they'd never done before. But they're so fed up by 1964 that the justices now feel liberated to adopt some unusual methods in responding to Southern recalcitrance.
It didn't end overnight, but as you moved on through the later 60s, the court began to step in more frequently, and integration actually began to take place.
The court is back in the game and is not going to abandon the game. Then, with the landslide election in 1964, you've got President Johnson enthusiastically backing civil rights, and 2/3 majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate of the Democratic Party. This is the era of validation of civil rights. The 1964 election functionally told the Supreme Court, "You were right in Brown. Good job."
When he arrived in Washington as a U.S. Senator, he started acquiring and reading the kinds of books that all of us say we're going to read, and you typically don't get around to it. Books like Thucydides, Gibbon, or Carlyle, really the great books. He would write in the margin and argue with the author. There'd be these marginal notations like rubbish or nonsense or no underscored. You could see this conversation going on between Hugo Black and the long-dead Greek or Roman author of that particular book. What I came to appreciate, the insight that came to me was that surely Hugo Black read the same kind of books that the founding generation read, that the worldview he had of the Constitution was framed by books that would have been on the shelves of an educated 18th century person, like the ones who went to Philadelphia in 1787.
Hugo Black's story didn't start in a library, but a courtroom in the Old South. He'd seen justice dispensed, and injustice too, that stemmed from poverty, bigotry, or simple ignorance, especially where the states would not bow to the Bill of Rights.
Hugo Black worked in courthouses as a trial lawyer in Alabama. He was a police court superintendent at one point. He was aware of police brutality. Confessions were being extracted from innocent people by third-degree techniques. There was no right to a lawyer. You could be held incommunicado by the police. And he thought that the Bill of Rights ought to protect citizens against abuse by local police, by state governments, by state legislatures.
Before the war in court, states had a great deal of latitude in terms of how they would conduct their criminal justice system. So, unless there was some gross abuse of police authority, states could largely do what they wanted to do.
Since the 1940s, Hugo Black had been arguing that the Civil War had changed all that. That if the 14th Amendment meant anything, it was that the Bill of Rights must protect people not only against the federal government, but against the actions of any government in every state.
He says, quote, its provisions may be thought outdated abstractions by some, and it is true that they were designed to meet ancient evils, but they are the same kind of human evils that have emerged from century to century whenever excessive power is sought by the few at the expense of the many. In my judgment, Hugo Black goes on, the people of no nation can lose their liberty so long as a Bill of Rights like ours survives. I would follow what I believe was the original purpose of the 14th Amendment, to extend to all the people of the nation the complete protection of the Bill of Rights.
Clarence Earl Gideon had broken into a pool hall in Florida and had been convicted of breaking and entering, but he didn't have a lawyer. He was too poor to afford one. And when the case got to the Supreme Court, the argument on behalf of Gideon was it's simply a violation of due process of law for a person to be tried and convicted in a criminal court without a lawyer. People that can afford one have those protections, but poor people don't.
It was something that every American could understand was wrong. If the prosecutor's a lawyer and you are an indigent defendant, which probably means you're really down on your luck, how are you going to win?
Gideon was the one that somehow went to the heart of the whole criminal trial process. Gideon was the embodiment of Hugo Black's argument that Bill of Rights guarantees ought to apply to the states. I knew as we worked on that opinion, here was one that was going to be in the case books as long as people study American constitutional law. This would be one of the big ones.
For Black, the restrictions on state power were in the words of the Constitution. There it was, in black and white. But if the text was his mandate, it was also his limit. By 1965, he had to split with his longtime colleague and ally, William O. Douglas. Black and Douglas, the New Dealers, now old men, had voted together for a quarter century, but not in Griswold versus Connecticut. The case was about an old state law that made it a crime to give contraceptives, even advice about preventing pregnancies, even to married couples. For Douglas, this looked like his last best chance to enshrine a right to privacy into constitutional case law. To Douglas, there was nothing more sacred than the right to be left alone, and the way he went at asserting that right was also characteristic Douglas. He simply declared it. Anyone who didn't like it could go to hell.
Justice Douglas's opinion was quite radical, in that it didn't ground this right of privacy in a single place in the Constitution.
He didn't find explicitly a right to privacy, but he says if you look to the First Amendment, the right to association and the right to believe what you will, and you look to the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures, and you look at the Fifth Amendment, the right to be protected against self-incrimination, that if you put all these various, the emanations and penumbras from those explicit rights together, you surely have a constitutional right to privacy. And that was his opinion.
Douglas's assertion wasn't good enough for Hugo Black. It was as if he'd pulled his rumpled old copy of the Constitution out of his pocket just to check, and he couldn't find the word privacy in there anywhere. "I like my privacy as well as the next one," he wrote in his dissent, "but I am nevertheless compelled to admit that the government has a right to invade it, unless prohibited by some specific constitutional provision." More and more through the 1960s, Black's liberal colleagues pushed into territory where he wouldn't follow. The leadership of the liberal wing was passing to younger colleagues, like William Brennan from New Jersey. Nevertheless, where Black saw his way clear, say on issues of a fair trial, he was still in the vanguard. In 1966, the court put an end to a practice that Hugo Black had seen and decried as a young prosecutor, back in Birmingham in the 1920s.
In Miranda against Arizona, the court finally came to the last stage of its concern with police brutality and interrogation techniques which they thought were unfair. And they did it in a fairly dramatic fashion. If you're going to admit a confession against the defendant at trial, you've got to show that he was warned that he had a right to remain silent. And more importantly, that he had a right to a lawyer if he wished one, and finally, that if he couldn't afford a lawyer, the state would pay for one.
After the war in court, you cannot introduce illegally seized evidence into a trial. States can't do that. Previously, they could. After Gideon v. Wainwright, you have to have an attorney represent you in a trial. After Miranda, you cannot use a coerced confession in a trial to demonstrate guilt. That has to be excluded from a trial. So what you do is you move from a state-based criminal justice system to a criminal justice system that has to conform with nationally imposed rules.
30 years had passed since Black joined the court. He had little left to prove now. When LBJ appointed Thurgood Marshall, the man who'd led the legal assault on segregation, Marshall asked that old Klansman Hugo Black to give him the oath of office. But just as Black's great Arch of Rights was receiving its capstone, people started saying it should be torn down. As Marshall took his seat, cities were going up in flames. There was a crime wave in the country. Public attitudes about the court were changing, and not for the better. Was the court protecting liberties or criminals?
Mr. Justice, do you think that those decisions have made it more difficult for the police to combat crime?
Certainly. Why shouldn't they? What were they written for? Why did they write the Bill of Rights? They practically all relate to the way cases shall be tried. And practically all of them make it more difficult to convict people of crime. What about guaranteeing a man a right to a lawyer? Of course that makes it more difficult to convict him. What about saying he shall not be compelled to be a witness against himself? That makes it more difficult to convict him. What about no such unreasonable search or seizure shall be made? That makes it more difficult. They were written to make it more difficult.
Black could protest in his time-honored way. There are the words in black and white. But the country around him was changing. No one saw the change more clearly than the GOP nominee for president in 1968.
Some of our courts, in their decisions, have gone too far in weakening the peace forces as against the criminal forces in this country.
Crimes of violence in the United States have almost doubled in recent years. Today, a violent crime is committed every 60 seconds.
Richard Nixon has a heyday with these rulings, particularly Miranda. He says that the Warren Court has been coddling criminals. And he sets out to win the White House in part based on the idea that he will appoint new justices to the Supreme Court.
And it will get worse unless we take the offensive. Freedom from fear is a basic right of every American. We must restore it.
Some of our courts in their decisions have gone too far.
Nixon may not have known what to do about the riots in the cities or about Vietnam. but he knew who he wanted to run against. If he could put together fear of crime in the big northern cities with the South's resentment of the Warren Court, that combination would be a winner. Nixon would try to turn the court away from its agenda of civil rights and personal rights, to take the restraints off of government power, to usher in the counter-revolution.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office.
That I will faithfully execute the office.
The irony is palpable. Warren administers the oath of office to a man who, when he ran for president to change, in part, the court that Warren had created, the constitutional vision that Warren had created, Warren's notion of what is just and right, and what really is, in Warren's sense, America.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Hugo Black was approaching his 83rd birthday, the end of the long game. But he was still playing. Maybe he thought he could outlast Nixon. More important, after 32 years on the court, he knew what he'd done.
I think he let January 20th, 1969 pass without being very upset about it. I think he thinks the election of a mere president is not likely to change what has been put in place by the court. The court had accomplished so much. I mean, no one would have thought from the vantage point of the late 1930s that the court would be able to take on racial segregation, eliminate all the Jim Crow laws, protect rights of citizens against state government in the police stations and in searches and in seizures. No one would have thought all that could have been accomplished.
For more on landmark cases, the personalities behind the robes, and significant moments in Supreme Court history, visit pbs.org. The Supreme Court series is available on DVD for $79.99. A companion book is available for $25 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen. A president sweeps into power.
Richard Nixon has 4 appointments in less than 2 years.
But among the new justices he appoints, one man will leave his mark.
If people agreed with him, well and good. If they didn't, that was all right too.
The overwhelming characteristic of the Rehnquist court is confidence that we, the court, are able to resolve all the most contested questions of national life.
It's the Rehnquist Revolution, this time on the Supreme Court.
Tonight it's time for some honest talk about the problem of order of the United States. I, in a sense, am in the ring tonight, and I think this is the time and this is the place to take off the gloves and sock it to 'em.
Richard Nixon rides into town and says, "We will give you order. We will give you peace. We will give you what you want, which is security." So Nixon's promise is to end the chaos, to end the disorder. And part of that was, from his perspective, a function of the court.
Nixon's committed to appointing justices who will repudiate much of what the Warren Court's done.
Nixon gets his chance, and it's an extraordinary chance. This is something that no president since Roosevelt had had. He has 4 appointments in less than 2 years. There are 9 people on the court. That's almost half the court. You wipe out almost half of the Warren Court in one fell swoop. So the stage is set.
Nixon knew what sort of man he wanted. Strong conservatives who believed in law and order, nominees from the South, and with judicial experience, and young enough to serve some decades on the court. He wanted judges who would stick to the letter of the Constitution, and where it was fuzzy, let the government do what it liked. He called them strict constructionists. And to find them, a bright young man searched the rosters, the Assistant Attorney General, William H. Rehnquist.
Strict constructionists became the code word for not people like those on the court.
Strict constructionist was going to favor government and law enforcement against individual liberties, and certainly those of criminal suspects.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud tonight to nominate as the 15th Chief Justice of the United States, Judge Warren Burger.
It wasn't all easy. 2 Southern nominees, Clement Haynsworth and G. Harold Carswell, were rejected by the Senate. Nixon settled for Burger's childhood friend from Minnesota, the little-known federal appeals court judge Harry Blackmun. And finally, he got one man from the South, Lewis Powell, a Virginian. But by then, he'd burned through every name the Justice Department had collected. What about that Rehnquist fellow? Only 47, perfect, strong on law and order, critic of the Warren Court since the early 50s, a former clerk for Justice Robert Jackson. Not that Nixon knew all that. Renchberg? Nixon asked. Is he Jewish?
Nixon doesn't know him other than visually. And Rehnquist is something of a flamboyant dresser. He favored pink shirts. Richard Nixon was not a pink shirt kind of guy. Rehnquist had long hair. He wore it over his ears, and he had long mutton chop sideburns.
He had been #1 in his class at Stanford Law School. He had clerked for Justice Robert Jackson. He had written an article decrying the influence of liberal law clerks, making the court too liberal.
I remember him telling me a story that he won a lot of money in a betting pool because he was the only one who thought Eisenhower would beat Stevenson among the clerks for the presidency that year. So he always was by himself, sort of politically in some ways.
He was very, very smart, very, very conservative. He thought the Warren Court stood for a court that was much too overly solicitous of criminal suspect rights and communist sympathizers.
Rehnquist was the most active in the Nixon Justice Department in monitoring the work of anti-war groups who were thought to be a bit unpatriotic.
Rehnquist's hard opposition to the anti-war groups rang the alarm bells in the Senate. And then there was an allegation that, back in Phoenix, he'd served as a GOP poll watcher trying to keep blacks from voting. It was certainly fact that he wrote in opposition to a public accommodations law, contending that all the law in the world wouldn't make whites like colored folk. So what was the point? In the Judiciary Committee, Lewis Powell sailed through by unanimous vote. Rehnquist got by the same day, but with noise, contention, and a solid block of Democrats against him.
Between the Judiciary Committee voting him out and the full Senate considering his nomination, one of the magazines published a memo that he had written to Justice Robert Jackson about the court's landmark decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. And this memo made the argument that the court should not try to overturn racial segregation in the South.
In the mid-60s, when this whole nation was pouring out its heart to those who had been discriminated against for 100 years, the man who is now one step away from the Supreme Court was saying black people can't even go to drugstores to get an aspirin in Phoenix, Arizona.
The white people of this country simply don't have the decency, for the most part, to recognize that a man who kicks Negroes in the teeth is unfit to sit on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Let me tell you something. We've got much more right now on Rehnquist than we had on Carswell or Hainsworth when you fellas were saying you haven't got a chance.
It was the personal attacks out of his earlier years in Arizona that I think were unexpected to him. And I know those affected him deeply and took him by surprise.
Could you wait 1 minute, sir?
Sure.
Works for you.
I want to express my thanks to the Senate for having confirmed me, and again to the President for having shown the confidence in me that he did by nominating me, and to the many people in and out of government without whose loyal support the outcome might have been quite different. Thank you.
Will you answer some questions?
No, I'd rather not. Thanks.
I'll give you only one last bit of advice because you're going to be independent, Patrick, and that is don't let the fact that you were under heat change any of your views. I'll remember them. So just be as mean and rough as I said you were, okay? Thanks, Mr. All right, but just good luck. Bye. Bye.
Mean and rough were about law and order, but that wasn't what he would run into. Before he could even take the oath, his fellow justices were hearing a little-known case that would push them onto new terrain, ground they weren't eager to traverse.
You have a case coming from Texas, begun by a woman who on paper, at least, is named Jane Roe. She was 21 years old, she was pregnant, and she didn't want to have this baby. The Texas law was one of the strictest in the nation. It allowed abortion only in cases to save the life of the mother. So even if you had a situation where a young woman had been raped or the victim of incest, she still could not get an abortion in Texas.
Equal pay for equal work, join our round! Equal pay for equal work.
Women were by definition, by nature, intended, many people believed, to take care of homes and children. And to say that's not true, but that women have a right to be lawyers and doctors and police officers, that was radical.
You have the Equal Rights Amendment moving through the Senate and the House. You have Ms. Magazine being started by Gloria Steinem. You have the American Civil Liberties Union starting a women's rights project. There's a lot of agitation in America over women's rights.
There was an assumption that if you had a baby, if you were a mother, you were no longer entitled to pursue a career. Abortion rights meant symbolically that women did have choices. Women could say, not now, later, or not at all.
I think the justices believed that the women's rights movement was so clearly the wave of the future that was just about to happen that everybody's for abortion because everybody's for women's rights.
In fact, in conference, there was an easy majority for striking down the Texas law.
Warren Burger gives the opinion to his friend, Harry Blackmun. Harry Blackmun and Warren Burger had been childhood chums in Minnesota. Warren Burger, I think, believes that he could have more control over the opinion.
Blackmun didn't know why Burger assigned the opinion to him. Maybe because he'd been counseled to the Mayo Clinic back in Minnesota. But what would his doctor friends think about this case? Blackmun was in turmoil. At home, his 3 grown daughters happened to be visiting. So at supper, Blackmun put the question, "What are your views on abortion?" By the time his wife and 3 daughters sounded off on him, Blackmun announced, "I think I'll go lie down. I'm getting a headache."
Justice Blackmun was a very green justice at this point in his career. The workload is very tough. It's very much of a burden within the marble walls.
From CBS News headquarters in New York,
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions. The majority in cases from Texas and Georgia said that the decision to end a pregnancy during the first 3 months belongs to the woman and her doctor, not the government. Thus, the anti-abortion laws of 46 states were rendered unconstitutional.
How in the world did such a conservative justice write this incredibly activist liberal opinion in Roe? Well, if you go back and read the opinion, it doesn't read as some sort of charter of feminist rights. It reads as a charter of doctors' rights. He actually researched the history of abortion, and his visceral response was the state ought not to be telling doctors how to regulate pregnancy.
Whether you like abortion or dislike abortion, you can't like Justice Blackmun's majority opinion. It tells you a lot about the history of abortion. But what the history of abortion has to do with the United States Constitution is a tie that Justice Blackmun was not able to make. This is an opinion that has a result, but without reason.
He's looking at it in terms of a decision that should be left between a physician and a woman. But of course, this is a test of what the Constitution holds. And what he ends up doing in his opinion is grounding it in a right of privacy. William Rehnquist was in the Justice Department and helped screen Blackmun. And here he sees this man writing this very expansive opinion in Roe versus Wade. Lewis Powell is joining it. Warren Burger is joining it. Rehnquist is by himself among the Nixon appointees at that time. Bill Rehnquist saw the Constitution very narrowly protecting individual rights. So he never could have envisioned a right of privacy to be found in the Constitution.
Rehnquist is arguing that the court has no business deciding it. There's no constitutional hook, because you can't pretend that the text of the Constitution says anything about abortion. You can't pretend that the legislative history of the 14th Amendment says anything about abortion. You can't find a precedent in the Supreme Court that says anything about abortion. This one's out of the blue.
Bill Rehnquist felt that the states should have primary authority in those matters that were most affecting people in their day-to-day lives. They knew how to handle their own lives, and they didn't need a lot of supervision from the court.
Less than 10 years after the epic fight to end segregation, the idea that states could be trusted to be fair was not a widely held view on the court. Rehnquist ended up on the short end of so many 8-to-1 votes, the clerk started calling him the Lone Ranger.
Got to the point that a group of his early law clerks gave him a little Lone Ranger doll that he proudly displayed on the mantle in his chambers. But Justice Rehnquist came to the court with a well-defined legal philosophy, and he was going to articulate it.
Justice Rehnquist did have confidence that people can generally be trusted to do the right thing, at least in the long run. And I think that does color to some extent his view about the role of the Supreme Court. If you think people are basically pretty good, then you don't need a bunch of platonic guardians sitting in a marble hall in Washington, D.C., ordering them to do this or that.
He stood by himself. It didn't seem to trouble him. Even though he was the only dissenter, he wasn't going to change his views and say, okay, you got me, I'm by myself.
This is not an angry man. This is a man who is simply not winning at this point in time.
He was not a self-doubter, nor did he think he had to impose his views on the rest of the world. He just set out what he believed, and he thought it was persuasive, and if people agreed with him, well and good. If they didn't, that was all right too.
The court pecked at the borders of the Warren Court's work, put a couple of dents in the hated Miranda warnings, but suspects still had the right to remain silent. They still had lawyers. And Rehnquist was still the Lone Ranger. Nixon's appointees didn't turn out to be a majority of their own. They joined the existing court majority. That was under the influence of one of the most liberal justices in history, William J. Brennan.
Bill Brennan, over the 30-year period of his tenure on the court, had greater influence on domestic social policy than any president had had, and for that matter, than any other single individual had had.
Justice Brennan was active in using the Constitution to reshape American law and politics. He had real empathy for people who were weak or powerless, who life had treated badly, and he believed that people, should do what they could to help those people wherever they were. What was the Constitution for? What good was it if it didn't actually help to make the lives of the citizens of the United States better?
Brennan's approach to the law was that to have any impact on the law, you have to win the case. It takes 5 votes to win. That's the first thing he always told his clerks. You can't do anything here without 5 votes. So Brennan was adroit at doing what Warren did, which was walk the halls, work the justices, find out what could bring them to his position. He'd write memos. I don't think we're very far apart here. If I were to do this, could you see clear to sign the opinion? This is the Brennan style.
It was like there was this magnetic field within 5 feet of him, and I always felt that when I got that close to him, I guess I could remember vaguely that there were some decisions of his that I disagreed with, but I couldn't really remember which ones or why I would possibly have thought such a thing. He just had such a powerful warmth to him.
He was oftentimes able to reach in and win the case, much to the consternation of Berger, who had no strategic skills whatsoever.
Warren Burger was a conservative, fond of quoting a 19th century British historian who complained about the U.S. Constitution, "It's all sail and no anchor." He was even fonder of traveling to London and living like a lord. But try as he might, Chief Justice Burger was not equipped to build a conservative majority on the court. He was never going to lead the counter-revolution. The job of leadership would fall to a man who cared for no perquisites. Comfy wallabies on his big feet and a cheeseburger for lunch. Bill Rehnquist. It was he who would take on Brennan and one of Brennan's most cherished decisions, Fay versus Noya, from back in 1963, the high watermark of Warren Court activism.
The criminal law jurisprudence of the Warren Court is just thoroughly tied up with the race issue, and is very much undoing a deeply ingrained, long-standing system that involved mistreating blacks in the South. Justice Brennan believes the federal courts were going to have to do something to push that system and make it change. And that's only going to happen if the Supreme Court can expand the authority of the federal courts so that the federal courts can begin to push the state courts. And that's what they did in Fay v. Noya.
He didn't wish, and other justices on the court didn't wish, people to be languishing in jail because their convictions were obtained through violation of constitutional rights. It just doesn't seem fair.
Fay v. Noya was Justice Brennan's magnum opus. It's a rhapsody, it's poetry, it's song. It's his ode to individual rights and to individual liberties.
To Rehnquist, this ode looked like disrespect for the states and chaos in the federal courts. Brennan's opinion in Fay meant any convict could petition to overturn what the state had done. And thousands did. Federal courts were swamped. In 1977, in Wainwright versus Sykes, Rehnquist saw his chance to restore some order. This was the ground where the Nixon justices could make their stand, criminal procedure. And it was a states' rights issue, where Rehnquist's long years as the Lone Ranger might pay off.
Sykes had been convicted of third-degree murder based on confessions he had made to his wife and to the police. He called his wife and told her that he had killed somebody. His wife called the police. The police came to his trailer, found him there, found a dead body. He told the police what he had done. He was read his Miranda warnings. He was eventually convicted of the crime.
But 5 years later, the case arrived at the Supreme Court, with Sykes's lawyers claiming that the state had violated his constitutional rights because he'd never understood he had a right to remain silent. Sure, he never mentioned this in Florida courts, in any of his trials, but now his confession, his conviction, it should all be thrown out.
Rehnquist thinks of the defense lawyer as this shifty, ingenious person who's sandbagging his arguments because he wants to keep them away from the state court and go straight to a sympathetic lefty federal judge if he can get one, right? Whereas Brennan is thinking of these mistakes as arising from the fact that most defendants in state courts don't have very good lawyers. So these are just honest mistakes being made.
From Justice Rehnquist's point of view, Sykes had his day in court. He didn't say anything. Then he had a chance to appeal the issue, and he still didn't say anything. You get a reasonable number of bites at the apple, and that's the end of it. That's what finality means. And he would say that's doubly true when it's a federal court that's being used in this way to relitigate issues that have already been litigated fully and completely in the state court.
Rehnquist says, and this is, the law is a cold but clear arbiter. If you're going to make that argument, you have to make it in state courts because state courts deserve respect. To somebody like Rehnquist, the law is about rules. Rules must be followed. The law's job is to order. It is not to foster progress.
I think Justice Rehnquist's persuasive explication of his views in some of his early opinions gradually took hold. People read them, thought about them, and gradually said, well, wait a minute, there might be something to this point of view.
Intellectually, Rehnquist is clearly the leader there. He has the clearest vision and the best skills to produce the outcomes. Certainly none of the other conservative justices could have done that anywhere near as well as he did.
The vote in Sykes is 7-2. All the Nixon appointees, Byron White, Potter Stewart, and John Paul Stevens, the new Ford appointee, in the majority, with Rehnquist writing for the majority, protecting the autonomy of state criminal systems, with Brennan and Marshall, the two holdovers from the Warren Court, in dissent. On Rehnquist, Nixon got it right.
You place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
The kind of vision that Rehnquist stood for, which was so unusual in the 1970s, becomes much more possible when you have this much more conservative president preparing to make appointments to the court.
Ronald Reagan had a very strong feeling about the importance of states having the ability to truly represent their people in determining policy. He felt that that was true, particularly as a matter of what the courts should be doing.
Richard Nixon's strict constructionists had failed to change the court's direction. Now the buzzword wasn't law and order, but something more ambitious. The Reagan right didn't just want to untie the hands of police. They wanted to crack down on obscenity and godlessness, put a stop to affirmative action and abortion rights, the agenda that would come to be known as family values.
The social issues just had not been on anybody's mind when Nixon made his nominations to the court. Those emerge in the 1970s, and those are the major issues as the court moves into the 1980s. And the pressures on a president are to appoint justices who are going to now undo, ironically, decisions of the Burger Court.
The hope is that she's a vote against Roe v. Wade. The hope is she's a vote against kicking God out of the public schools. The hope is she's a vote against affirmative action.
Who represent that continuing tradition of law and liberty, Chief Justice Burger.
In 1986, Chief Justice Burger came to the president very privately and told him that he would like to retire from the court. In this case, the president kept it very quiet.
We're all in chambers one day just working on stuff, and somebody comes down and says, oh, quick, come down to the conference room, which had never happened. All of the clerks are there, and all of the justices are there, too, except for Burger and Rehnquist, and they'd set up a TV.
Reagan called a press conference at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the members of the news media had no idea why this was called.
Speak strongly urged the networks to carry it, which obviously means they think it's some sort of dramatic news.
Ladies and gentlemen, the
Warren
President
Burger's
of the
here.
United States.
When President Reagan walked in with Chief Justice Burger as well as Justice Rehnquist and Court of Appeals Judge Antonin Scalia, it took the press totally by surprise. It was one of the few instances in 8 years that there was absolutely no leak in advance of what was happening.
Today, I received with regret Chief Justice Burger's letter formally notifying me of his retirement. And I'm pleased to announce my intention to nominate William H. Rehnquist as the new Chief Justice of the United States. Upon Justice Rehnquist's confirmation, I intend to nominate Antonin Scalia, currently a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit.
You, sir, have had a reputation more as a thinker and writer on the court than as an administrator.
Do you consider it the culmination of a dream to be Chief Justice?
I wouldn't call it the culmination of a dream, but it's not every day when you're 61 years old that you get a chance to have a new job. And you take on some things you don't like along with a lot of things that you do like.
In that perspective, it's a perfect...
The reactions in the room were kind of like a mix like, wow. And then those few of us who knew something about Scalia, it was a kind of, whoa, because he is out there.
Antonin Scalia was the real thing. He believed in state power, he believed in government power. He took a narrower view of individual rights. He was conservative on law and order. To have the two of them come on the court together at the same time, that's a very powerful package on the court.
Antonin Scalia charmed the Senate and sailed through 98 to zip. Rehnquist was confirmed by the Senate, but not without breaking his own record for the greatest number of no votes. The Senate was voting on supposed ideology. Inside the court, ideology wasn't the big issue. Rehnquist would do the chief's job happily and well. He had to be an improvement.
Sir, what will you miss most about being Chief Justice?
Really nothing.
Burger was a ham-handed Chief Justice. He wasn't particularly competent in his opinion writing. It's good to see him go, and no one ever looked back.
When Rehnquist came in as the new Chief Justice, actually was a relief to his colleagues no matter what their ideology was, because he ran the court well. And while we think of the role of the court in the country, the other justices think of it as their job.
Rehnquist had the respect of the other justices. He had a certain intellectual rigor that they appreciated. Secondly, he was quite fair-minded.
He was never a believer in the self-importance of the job, very self-deprecating. People saw him walking, they would never imagine that this man was the member of the greatest judicial body in America. They might think he just came out of a bowling alley or a corner pub or something like that.
Rehnquist didn't care for ceremony. Meetings were quick. He liked a joke. He'd bet you on anything. The amount of snow that would fall that day on Capitol Hill, as measured by the Chief Justice of the United States. But the Reagan White House didn't make him chief because he was well-liked. They looked to him as the man who could pull the court to the right. Their revolution could last for 20 years, if they could somehow supply their new chief enough votes for a working majority.
In 1990, William Brennan retires. The following year, Thurgood Marshall steps down, and this closes off an era. Both of them represented the real liberalism of the Earl Warren time.
The retirements represented the possibility of a genuine change in the court's jurisprudence. It was a seismic event, to say the least.
Anthony Kennedy in 1988. David Souter in 1990. Clarence Thomas in 1991. Now there was a clear majority appointed by Presidents Reagan and Bush. And with this remade court, Rehnquist would lead a revolution, just not the one people expected.
The emotional display outside the Supreme Court, with pro-choice and pro-life activists facing off with their familiar props and chants and placards, and other spectators so determined to get in to hear the oral arguments they camped out all night in the rain. The display was a sharp contrast to the remarkable lack of emotion inside.
The abortion issue had been very difficult for the court ever since the decision in the 1970s in Roe against Wade. There are a great many in the country who never accepted its holding, and Casey put the court right back in the middle of the issue.
The belief was in early '92 that the decision in Roe versus Wade might be overturned, that there might finally be a majority on the court of Republican appointees who are ready to overturn the court's precedent in Roe versus Wade.
By the time Casey comes to court, the question is, are they going to do what they were put there to do?
I think there are votes on this court that would take away a fundamental constitutional right. We believe that's an extraordinarily radical step for the Supreme Court of the United States to bestow a fundamental right and then take it away from the millions of Americans that rely on that right.
Justice O'Connor becomes a figure of great interest and curiosity because She was one of the justices in the 1980s who began to argue against certain elements of the Roe versus Wade opinion. Her argument had been that as long as there was no undue burden on the woman, that you could regulate the abortion decision.
You have the remaining liberals, you've got these new conservatives really digging in on the right, and she's able to negotiate at the center, which gives her power. She would stand in this pastel suit with her white handbag dangling from her arm, seeming so non-threatening. She took advantage of that behind the scenes. She never bullied justices to her position. She sort of coaxed them over.
Well, one always hopes in crafting an opinion for the court that it will settle the issue for a time at least. Basically, we ended up with a joint opinion written by me and Justice Kennedy and Justice Souter. I think a reader of the opinion will find that we did not accept the trimester rigid framework of Roe against Wade, but basically did not vote to just overturn it outright, impose, we thought, or we hoped, would be reasonable limitations on the doctrine. And it was very difficult.
It's clearly an effort in an act of judicial statesmanship. The heart of the opinion is whatever we think about Roe versus Wade, we can't be seen as overturning an opinion because of political pressure.
Prior opinions of the court become part and parcel of the law, just as much as if Congress had passed a law. And we're bound by that precedent unless a later court determines that some prior holding must be overturned. It's not something that the court does lightly. And that, of course, precedent was a very big issue in the Casey decision.
Rehnquist had lost another abortion case, a dissenter again. Justice Kennedy came to apologize for changing his vote. Rehnquist shrugged it off. Just get your opinion out in expedient fashion. Win or lose, this was Rehnquist's court. He didn't want it to fall behind.
It's very interesting to compare Rehnquist and Scalia's dissents in the Casey case. Rehnquist is very laconic. He essentially says, the majority's got to decide, but I'm not that personally invested in which way it decides. By contrast, Scalia is angry and apocalyptic.
The dissent is almost a judicial primal scream from Scalia, in that you can see the conservative tide cresting just short of the beach, right? They're one vote short of where they wanted to go. And as it goes back out to sea, you get this very, very angry opinion.
The imperial judiciary lives, Scalia wrote. It is instructive to compare this Nietzschean vision of us unelected, life-tenured judges, leading a Volk who will be tested by following, with a somewhat more modest role envisioned for these lawyers by the founders.
There's truth to Scalia's statement, except it's applicable to Scalia as well, who is no different than any of the others in this. He just has a different set of issues onto which he's willing to speak as the imperial judiciary.
They aren't, in general, a deferring bunch. The trademark of the Rehnquist court, beginning in Casey, is that we are supreme in constitutional interpretation. It isn't, as the Warren court said, we make the rules of the game. The Rehnquist court thought, we are the game.
The chief himself knew which way the wind was blowing. Power for a Rehnquist court could bring back power to the states. For 22 years, Rehnquist had been fighting federal mandates, civil rights orders, minimum wage laws, racial quotas, as Congress extended its reach into every cranny of the country.
Rehnquist disliked that. He said, no, the Congress's commerce power can't be endless. There has to be some limit to it in the interest of federalism and local competence.
Since the New Deal, the scope of Congress's powers had been pretty much resolved in Supreme Court decision-making. The justices had said for 50 years that under the Congress's authority to regulate commerce, if it wants to regulate things, then it's up to Congress to decide how broad that authority should be.
In 1994, Rehnquist got a case where he could finally draw the line. United States versus Lopez was a challenge to Congress's power to make a federal law against bringing a gun near a school. There was already a state law in place. More to the point, what did keeping guns away from schools have to do with interstate commerce?
The theory on which Congress could regulate it is this. If you have guns in schools, it's bad for education. And if kids are badly educated, they're going to do poorly in the workforce. The national economy is going to suffer. Therefore, commerce generally among the states will suffer. That's the theory on which Congress passes it.
What the court does in Lopez is say by a vote of 5-4 that Congress doesn't have the authority under the Constitution to regulate schools in this way. If this is to be regulated, it is to be regulated by states.
This was the first time in 60 years that the court had limited Congress's commerce power. I had taught generations of law students that they would never live to see the day when the court said Congress has any limit to its commerce power. Well, they did.
It was one of the great and important constitutional revolutions since the New Deal, and it was led by Chief Justice Rehnquist.
But this didn't look like the revolution the right had intended. So far, the Rehnquist court hadn't outlawed abortion, hadn't attacked obscenity, or put prayer back into the public schools. They hadn't even rolled back one of the most reviled of the Warren Court decisions, the Miranda warnings, the very notion of telling cops what to say. The Rehnquist court had a chance to wipe out Miranda in the year 2000, in Dickerson versus United States. Congress itself had enacted legislation that seemed to overrule the Miranda decision. The Supreme Court could simply uphold the legislation.
William Rehnquist hated Miranda, hated the Miranda rights, thought the court had no business imposing those rules on the police.
If one reads Miranda, it's not clear whether it comes out of the Constitution or whether it's simply something which the court has created as a court-made remedy.
Rehnquist, throughout the 70s, in his Lone Ranger days, was more than happy to say Miranda is not a constitutional decision. It should be reversed. So Dickerson comes to the court, Miranda's got to go. The logic would be.
I do think there's a special responsibility that comes with being the chief to look out for the institutional stability, security, and prerogatives of the court. And I'd be surprised if Justice Rehnquist's view on a number of areas didn't change when he moved from an associate justice to being the chief justice. I suppose that perhaps the clearest example of that was his opinion in the Dickerson case.
Miranda stays by a vote of 7-2, and it stays with one-time critic William Rehnquist writing the majority opinion and saying not only is Miranda sound precedent, but Miranda is correct. The Constitution requires police to read criminal suspects their rights.
Maybe Miranda should be overturned, but if it's to be overturned, it's got to be us and not Congress. So actually the opinion he writes is one about judicial supremacy, which is Congress has no business telling us what the Constitution should be interpreted to mean, and so this law can't do it.
This was the full flower of the Rehnquist court. It wasn't a social counter-revolution. It was a revolution in the power of the court itself.
The overwhelming characteristic of the Rehnquist court is confidence, self-confidence that we, the court, are able and ready to resolve all the most contested questions of national life.
The Rehnquist court drew the line on abortion, on affirmative action, on criminal procedure, and on the power of Congress. Most important, on the subject of what the Constitution allowed, this court made sure no one else could draw the line. And for the most part, the nation approved. In the year 2000, 85% of the U.S. public expressed confidence in the Supreme Court. Rehnquist and his court would put that public confidence on the line.
Florida today began an official vote recount. Bush leads Gore in the state by just a minuscule percentage, now down to about 1,400 votes total. Whoever wins Florida will pick up 25 electoral votes, topping the 270 needed to be elected president.
The shouting may have subsided now after the most contentious, some say most suspect, presidential election in history, but the battle goes on.
Thousands thousands of people in Palm Beach are asking for another chance to vote in this election.
You voted, you lost. Give it up.
At issue, the ballot.
We think of presidential elections as kind of national elections, but actually each presidential election is an election made in each individual state about how that state is going to choose its presidential electors. And the assumption was that this is a matter for state law. They make the final decision.
Everybody has a different impression of what's a vote. One says it's a dimple, one says it's a pimple, one says it's pregnant, one says it's a hanging door. So the Chad, as it's become known, is probably the most misunderstood terminology in America.
The justices took a look at what was happening and said, you know, this is awful. This is a mess. Somebody has to clean this up. Who better than us? The people trust us. We can bring this to a halt.
Given the institutional authority of the court and the generally high regard with which it is held, Rehnquist's perception is the court can do this. It's a short, sharp shock. You go in knowing that this is going to be a one-of-a-kind experience, and you end the trauma. And that may have been the logic of it. But notice that's not a legal logic. It's a political logic.
In fact, when the Rehnquist court accepted the petition for review, it ripped the case right out of the hands of the Supreme Court of Florida.
We'll hear argument now in number 00949, George W. Bush and Richard Cheney versus Albert Gore et al.
The people who usually argue for states' rights, Rehnquist, Scalia, O'Connor, Kennedy, and Thomas, are in the majority imposing on the state of Florida.
Bush v. Gore said to the Florida Supreme Court, "Court, you have changed the counting standard in the middle of the election. Therefore, the manual recount has to stop."
Notwithstanding their usual view that state courts have competency to read state constitutions, so they stepped in, they slapped down the Florida Supreme Court. Now, there's an act of self-confidence. There's a court that believes it knows where it's at, it knows who's got the final answer, and is willing to tell the country as much.
It is an extraordinary statement of the esteem in which the Supreme Court is held, that the court could decide a very disputed presidential election in a very disputed way, and yet a few months later the court's reputation is as strong and the esteem in which it's held is as high as it ever was.
When polls were taken, the question was put, do you think the court was being partisan? The majority of people said yes. But interestingly enough, people trust the court, so there's an ability of people to entertain two conflicting views. Bush versus Gore is partisan, but we trust the Supreme Court.
Rehnquist gave most of his life to the court. In almost 2 decades as its chief, he was its protector, as had been all the great Chief Justices, back to John Marshall. When Rehnquist died as chief in 2005, people talked about him as an unassuming man. Friends recalled his addition of gold stripes to his robe as a whimsy inspired by light opera. He eschewed real drama. He didn't seek the limelight, but he left the court with an authority that it didn't have when he came.
Isn't that interesting that here's William Rehnquist, who comes to the Supreme Court in 1972, appearing to represent a point of view that wishes to curb and curtail judicial power, who then many years later is among those who joins the majority in Bush versus Gore, which may well be as activist opinion as the modern Supreme Court has handed down. I'm not sure the Warren Court would have taken Bush versus Gore. I think we're going to look back on the Rehnquist Court as having been one of those truly historic, discernible chapters in the court's history.
He would have loved to have seen Roe versus Wade overturned. He would have loved to have seen prayer in school. He would have wanted to see more movement in terms of social issues to reverse the legacy of Earl Warren. He didn't get that, but he did get other things.
William Rehnquist will go down as one of the most influential Chief Justices in history, and really for 2 reasons. He brought back the states as central players in American constitutionalism and required Congress to defer to them. And he was quick to assert judicial supremacy. and was quite confident having the court decide contested constitutional issues, even if that meant setting aside a large number of acts of Congress or acts of state legislatures or actions taken by the president. His was a strong, muscular view of the role of the Supreme Court.
We've come a long way since Marbury versus Madison, when Justice Marshall very gingerly tried to suggest that the Jefferson administration wasn't doing the right job. It's a court that has developed enormous power and enormous prestige in the political system.
The Supreme Court of the United States is the most powerful judicial tribunal in the world. It tells us what the relationship of the co-equal branches of the federal government are, and what the relationship of the federal government to the states are, and what the relationship of government is to individual rights and liberties. Well, that's a very broad mandate.
The court is no longer timid. Both the left and the right on the court are activists. If by that you mean judges who see their essential role as deciding the hard questions that are faced in American society, I don't see any tendency to hold back.
Today, the court stands as a huge institution at the center of American politics. And whether that's a good or a bad thing is a question that people really ought to think about.
The legitimacy and the acceptance of what the court does depends upon how people view the institution. The court is always vulnerable and has been throughout its history. And I think justices, myself and others, should view ourselves as trustees of an extremely valuable institution that has built up over the centuries and has served the country very well in ensuring the rule of law and has the ability to reach unpopular decisions that will nonetheless be followed.
For more on landmark cases, the personalities behind the robes, and significant moments in Supreme Court history, visit pbs.org. The Supreme Court series is available on DVD for $79.99. A companion book is available for $25 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.